When I was 9 years old, I found a staircase in the woods behind my house. It was winter, the ground frozen and the trees stripped bare, the whole forest looking skeletal under a gray sky. I had walked that stretch of trees 100 times with my dog, Rex, but on that particular day, the staircase was just there. It wasn't attached to a house or a foundation, and it wasn't some crumbled ruin, just an immaculate set of stone steps that climbed up and ended abruptly in nothing. I stopped and stared, Rex circling it warily, his ears pressed flat against his head. There were no footprints leading to it, no disturbances in the dirt. It simply stood there, as if it had grown out of the ground like a tree. I don't remember deciding to climb it. It felt more like the idea was dropped into my head, fully formed, and I obeyed. I put a hand on the bottom step, and it was warm. That should have been the first sign that something was wrong. It had snowed the night before, and everything was still frozen and brittle, but the stone felt like it had been sitting in the sun for hours. I took a deep breath and placed my foot on the first step. Nothing happened. Rex growled softly, but I ignored him and kept going. The wind around me stilled as I climbed higher, and the world fell quiet, as if the trees were holding their breath. By the time I reached the sixth step, everything changed. I looked up, and the forest was gone. The sky above me had turned a color I'd never seen before, something between deep red and gold, swirling like ink dropped into water. The air smelled strange, too, like honey and smoke, sweet and sharp at the same time. I turned to look back, but the woods weren't there anymore. The staircase stretched down into a black void, and my house, my yard, my world, everything I knew, had vanished. I was surrounded by silence so complete it rang in my ears, and I realized I was shaking. I could feel the steps beneath me, solid and warm, but there was nothing else. No sound, no wind, no forest. Just me and the staircase hanging in a space I couldn't understand. That's when I heard it. A voice, soft and melodic, drifting up from the top of the stairs. It wasn't speaking words I recognized, but I understood anyway. It was calling me forward. I turned to face the top of the staircase, squinting into the strange sky. There was nothing there. No door, no person, no reason for me to keep climbing. But the voice grew clearer, curling around me like smoke, making promises I couldn't quite hear. I knew I should have turned back. I knew that whatever waited for me up there wasn't meant for me. But when you're 9 years old, you don't think about what things mean. You think about what's next. So I climbed. At the 10th step, I saw the doorway. It wasn't like any door I'd seen before. Just an outline of shimmering light, shifting and bending like liquid gold. Beyond it, I could see shapes moving, but I couldn't make sense of them. They weren't people, and they weren't animals. They were just things. Something about the way they moved made my head ache, like I wasn't supposed to be looking at them. The voice was louder now, filling my head, whispering almost words, closer, closer. I reached out to touch the light, and before I could stop myself, I stepped through. For a moment, there was nothing but brightness. My vision went white, and I felt a pressure in my chest, like the air had been sucked out of me. Then the light receded, and I found myself standing in a vast, empty hall. It was enormous, so large I couldn't see the walls or the ceiling. The floor was made of something smooth and reflective, like black glass, and my footsteps echoed endlessly as I walked. The only thing in the hall was a chair. It sat in the center of the space, draped in red fabric, with something resting on the seat. As I got closer, I saw that it was a mask. The mask was made of bone-white porcelain, smooth and featureless except for 2 hollow eyes and a faintly smiling mouth. It looked old, like something that had been passed down for generations, but it was pristine. The voice returned then, low and soft, as if it were whispering directly into my ear. "Put it on." I took a step back, my hands curling into fists. "I don't want to," I said aloud, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped, and the silence was worse. It sat heavy in the hall, pressing against me, filling my ears until I thought my head might split open. "Put it on," the voice said again, sharper this time. My legs moved on their own. I reached for the mask, my fingers brushing the cool porcelain, and I felt something shift inside me, like a key turning in a lock. I lifted it to my face and pressed it against my skin. The world exploded. There's no other way to describe it. Colors, sounds, sensations. I felt everything at once, like I had been shattered into 1,000 pieces and scattered across the universe. I saw forests burning under black suns. I saw oceans rising to swallow cities made of glass. I saw people with hollow faces staring at me from the edges of my vision, whispering things I couldn't hear. I was nowhere and everywhere, trapped in a chaos I couldn't escape. And then it stopped. I woke up in the woods, lying on the ground with snow in my hair. Rex was barking in the distance, and my head throbbed as though someone had driven a spike through it. I sat up slowly, my hands trembling, and looked around. The staircase was gone. The forest was quiet again, the trees swaying gently in the wind as if nothing had happened. I made my way home, stumbling through the snow with my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't tell anyone what happened, because I didn't know how. How do you explain that the world opened up and swallowed you, then spat you back out like nothing had changed? How do you explain the voice, the mask, the feeling that something followed you back? Because that's the thing. It didn't end when I left the woods. 4 years afterward, I would see it out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of light where there shouldn't be any. A whisper I couldn't quite hear. A shape, standing just at the edge of my vision, wearing a white mask that smiled faintly whenever I turned to look. At night, I dream of staircases. They stretch endlessly into skies I can't describe, and there's always a door at the top. The voice waits for me there, calling me forward, telling me it's time to come back. I always wake up before I reach it, gasping for breath, my skin slick with sweat, but I know it's waiting. One day, I'll climb those steps again. I'll reach the door, and this time, I don't think I'll come back. So, I have this little issue when I start liking someone. Every time I develop a crush, like a real, heart-skipping, oh no, I'm doomed kind of crush, I wake up to find a door that shouldn't be there. It doesn't appear in my dreams. It doesn't announce itself with ominous creaks or mysterious glowing. It just exists, usually somewhere completely nonsensical. Once it was in my closet, wedged awkwardly between my sweaters and laundry basket. Another time it appeared smack in the middle of my kitchen, like an unruly guest. The door always looks the same. A dark wood frame, polished brass handle, no keyhole, no peephole, and no obvious reason for being there. It's just there, sitting in my reality like, yeah, hi, good luck ignoring me. The first time it happened, I was 13 and crushing on this boy named Caleb who sat next to me in algebra. He had a ridiculous haircut, straight up bowl cut, and laughed like a seal, but in my lovesick brain, he was a Renaissance painting. One day, I woke up and found the door standing in the corner of my room, a little too tall, almost grazing the ceiling. I poked it. I knocked on it. I even called for my mom because what the hell, right? She came in and looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "What door?" she asked. I pointed, right there. But she couldn't see it. She just patted my shoulder, told me to get more sleep, and left me alone with the thing. That was when I realized the door was mine and mine alone. It only existed for me. It took me 2 weeks to work up the courage to open it. I don't know why I was so scared. Maybe because I'd seen enough movies to know doors that shouldn't exist rarely lead anywhere good. But I couldn't leave it alone, so one night, I grabbed the handle, took a deep breath, and pulled. On the other side was a hallway. Not a creepy, haunted hallway, mind you, but an infinite, winding space full of door after door, all of them locked. It was quiet, too quiet, like the air had forgotten how to carry sound. There were no windows, no lights except for a strange glow coming from far, far down the hallway. It felt like the kind of place you stumble into when the world glitches. And at the very center of the floor, right where I stood, there was a small tag that said, "For you." I freaked out, obviously, slammed the door shut, and slept with the lights on for the next 3 days. By the time I'd calmed down enough to investigate again, the door had vanished. Caleb stopped being my crush shortly after, so I didn't think much about it. I convinced myself it was some bizarre fever dream and moved on. But then, it happened again. Senior year, there was Lily, the quiet, sarcastic girl who always drew cartoons in the margins of her notebooks. This time, the door appeared in my basement, tucked behind the washing machine. Same design, same handle, same inexplicable aura of importance. I tried to ignore it. I avoided doing laundry for a week, but the more I ignored it, the louder it got. And by louder, I mean I felt it buzzing, like an itch in my brain that wouldn't go away. So I opened it again. This time, the hallway looked different. Same layout, same endless path of locked doors. But now there were whispers. Faint, overlapping voices, like 100 people were having hushed conversations just out of earshot. And at the end of the hallway, I could see a soft light glowing. I felt this overwhelming urge to walk toward it. I didn't get far, maybe 10 steps, before I chickened out and sprinted back to reality. That's the thing about the door. Every time I crush on someone, it reappears somewhere new. Sometimes it's polite. It'll show up in my garage or tucked in a corner of my attic. Other times, it's a menace. It appeared once at the back of my fridge. I pulled out the milk and almost screamed when I saw it sitting there, wedged between condiments and leftover pasta. I've learned not to bother telling anyone about it. I tried once, in college, when I was crushing on my lab partner, Diego. So, do you ever get mysterious doors appearing when you like someone? I asked. He said, no. Do you need to lie down? Fair enough. Anyway, here's the kicker. I've never made it to the end of the hallway. I've tried. The further I go, the louder the whispers get, the brighter that soft, golden light becomes. It's always out of reach, like the hallway stretches itself just a little bit longer every time I step closer. I don't know what's behind that glow. Part of me thinks it's where the answers are. Answers about the door, about why it follows me, about what it wants. Another part of me is terrified it's something I'm not ready to face. A couple of months ago, I started crushing on someone new, Matt, a guy from my art class who paints like he's bottling emotions. The door appeared inside my linen closet, tucked between towels like it belonged there. I opened it on instinct, barely hesitating. The hallway looked different yet again. This time, the air felt warmer, and the whispers sounded clearer. I swear I heard someone say my name. I took a few steps toward the glow before stopping and asking myself the same question I always do. What if this isn't about them? What if this is about me? The hallway doesn't feel like it's trying to lure me somewhere dangerous. If anything, it feels like it's waiting for me. Maybe every crush is just a trigger, a little emotional spark that lights up the doorway to something bigger. A space inside me that I've been too afraid to explore. Maybe the locked doors lining that hallway are all the pieces of myself I haven't fully opened yet. I don't know. I don't have the answers. But the door is still there, waiting in the linen closet. I haven't crushed on anyone since Matt, so it stayed quiet. I think part of me is scared of what'll happen when I finally reach the light at the end. But another part of me, maybe the brave, foolish part, can't wait to find out. So, here's my question. Does anyone else have something like this? Something weird that happens when you like someone? Something that doesn't make sense but feels real anyway? Or is it just me wandering an endless hallway, wondering what's on the other side? I moved into the house 2 weeks ago, a crumbling Victorian with peeling paint and windows that rattled when the wind blew. It had been cheap, too cheap, on account of needing some work, but I'd convinced myself I could handle it. I was in one of those phases where life feels stagnant and meaningless, and I thought, why not? If I couldn't fix myself, maybe I could fix a house. The first night, I noticed it. The walls had texture, floral wallpaper that had gone brittle and bubbled in places. It looked harmless enough until I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in that strange quiet of a house that hasn't yet learned your sounds. It wasn't long before I realized the quiet wasn't quite silent. I heard a faint murmur. It was subtle, like wind slipping between cracks or the hiss of distant rain. But when I pressed my ear to the wall, don't ask me why I did it, it became clearer. It wasn't wind at all. It was voices, words just on the edge of comprehension, layered on top of each other, like 100 people were whispering at once. I yanked back, my heart pounding. I told myself it was pipes. Houses like this were old. They groaned, rattled, complained. It was normal. I didn't sleep well that night, but the next morning, sunlight streamed through the cracked shutters and made everything seem ordinary again. I ignored the voices, or at least I tried to. But the next night, they were louder. I could hear them through the wallpaper in every room. The tone wasn't hostile, exactly, but it wasn't kind either. It reminded me of a crowd at a theater just before the curtain rises, a low, anticipatory hum, as though the house itself was waiting for something. On the third night, I saw her. I was painting the study, a small room at the back of the house, with a high ceiling and a fireplace filled with soot that looked like no fire had burned there in 100 years. I'd been trying to distract myself from the voices. I had headphones in, blasting music, when I caught something in the corner of my eye. There was someone in the doorway. I turned so fast I nearly dropped my roller. The doorway was empty. I ripped out my headphones, my breath shallow, and listened. The house was silent, but the air felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I stepped into the hallway, searching for signs of movement, but there was nothing, just shadows where shadows belonged. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just overtired, breathing too many paint fumes, or letting the house mess with my head. I went back into the study, but I left the door open, just in case. When I woke up that night, I knew I wasn't alone. At first, it was just a feeling, a presence, a weight in the dark. Then I saw her again, clearer this time. She was standing at the foot of my bed, dressed in a tattered gray gown that hung off her frame like it was soaking wet. Her skin was pale, too pale, and her hair dripped down in limp strands as if she'd just climbed out of a lake. She stared at me with eyes that looked wrong, wide and unblinking, too glossy, reflecting light that wasn't there. She opened her mouth like she was about to say something, but no sound came out, just a soft, hissing exhale that sent chills rushing over me. I tried to move, to shout, to do something, but I couldn't. My limbs were frozen, pinned beneath an invisible weight. The air thickened, growing colder and colder until I could see my breath misting in front of me. Then she moved. It wasn't walking. It was like she glided across the floor, her feet not touching the ground. She stopped beside the wall, where the wallpaper bubbled and curled, and she reached out a hand. Her fingers sank into it, into the wallpaper, and when she pulled back, a chunk of it tore away. Underneath wasn't plaster. It wasn't wood. It was dark, endless. She turned back to me then, her mouth stretching into a smile that was too wide, too sharp. The whispers started again, rising up from the walls like they were alive, their words frantic now, like warning bells. Don't look, don't look, don't look. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. My room was empty, but the air was freezing. The corner of the wallpaper by the door was torn, just like in the dream, or whatever it had been. I stared at it, my chest heaving, and knew I had to see what was beneath it. With trembling hands, I grabbed the edge of the paper and ripped. The wallpaper came away easily, as though it was happy to be removed. The whispers grew louder with each tear, more frantic, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound. And there, beneath the wallpaper, I saw it, a door. It was smaller than a regular door, low and narrow, as if built for someone who didn't need much space. The wood was blackened and splintered, and the handle was made of iron, cold to the touch. I hesitated, every instinct in my body screaming at me to leave it alone. But the whispers had changed now. They weren't warnings anymore. They were pleading. Open it. I don't know why I listened. Maybe I was still caught in a dream. Maybe the house had sunk its claws into me the day I moved in. I turned the handle, and the door creaked open, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward into complete blackness. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and returned to the door. The light barely pierced the dark, but I stepped onto the stairs. They creaked beneath my weight, the sound disappearing into the void below. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of mold and stagnant water. I kept walking. The whispers followed me, slithering along the walls like fingers on silk. The stairs ended abruptly, spilling me into a vast underground chamber. My flashlight flickered, and I swept it across the room. The walls were covered in faces. Not real faces, but carved into the stone. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide and hollow. The light caught movement at the center of the room. It was her. The woman from my dreams stood there, her back to me, facing a massive black well. It was ancient, the stones around it slick with moisture, and something inside it moved, a slow, endless ripple, like the surface of a living thing. She raised her hand, pointing to the well, and as she did, the whispers grew deafening. "Let it out." I took a step back, my flashlight shaking. She turned toward me, her face a hollow mask of emptiness. "Let it out," she said again, her voice layered with all the others, as if the faces on the walls were speaking through her. I ran. I don't remember how I got back to the surface, but I woke up in the hallway, sprawled on the wooden floor. The door was gone, the wallpaper smooth and pristine as though it had never been torn. The house was silent, the whispers gone, but I knew better. I packed a bag and left that day, the house disappearing in the rearview mirror as I drove without stopping. I've tried to forget, to convince myself it was all in my head, but sometimes, in the silence of the night, I hear it again, that faint murmur in the walls. A whisper, waiting for someone to listen. It started with a clock, not one of those sleek, digital clocks that hum quietly on your nightstand, but an old one, the kind that ticks loudly, each second a little heartbeat that fills the silence of a room. I found it in a thrift store downtown, the sort of place that smelled like mothballs and mystery, where every shelf was crowded with things that seemed to hold secrets. The clock sat on a high shelf, tucked behind chipped porcelain figurines and dusty photo frames with strangers' faces staring out from behind cracked glass. It wasn't anything special to look at: black wood, brass accents, the faintest hint of a carved design that had long since faded. But it was the ticking that got me. I hadn't even planned on buying anything, just killing time while waiting for my bus. But as I stood there, listening, the ticking grew louder, insistent, like it wanted my attention. The clock didn't have a price tag, so I carried it to the counter where the cashier, an older woman with enormous glasses, squinted at it like it had just appeared out of thin air. "Haven't seen this one before," she muttered, her voice crackling like old paper. $5 sound fair?" I paid, and she dropped the clock into a bag, its ticking muffled but still there, persistent. When I got home, I set the clock on the shelf in my living room and wound it, just to see if it still worked. It did. The ticking filled the space, steady and hypnotic. I liked the sound more than I expected. It made my apartment feel alive, like there was something there to keep me company, even though I lived alone. That first night, I fell asleep listening to it, my dreams soft and strange, full of whispers I couldn't quite make out. By the next morning, I noticed something was off. The clock was still ticking, but the hands hadn't moved. They were frozen at 3:17. I frowned, tapping the glass face, winding it again for good measure. Still, the hands didn't budge. The ticking never stopped, though. It continued, steady and smooth, filling the quiet like a question I didn't know how to answer. That night, it happened again. The strange dreams. I was walking through a house I didn't recognize, its halls endless and lined with doors. I could hear the ticking echoing all around me, growing louder as I moved. I tried opening the doors as I passed, but they were all locked, the handles cold and unyielding. At the end of the hallway stood a single door, slightly ajar, with a thin beam of light spilling out beneath it. The ticking was deafening now, pounding in my ears like the heartbeat of something enormous. I reached for the door, and woke up. The clock still sat on the shelf, its hands frozen at 3:17. I tried to shake it off. Weird dreams happen, I told myself. It's just stress, or the sound of the clock worming its way into my subconscious. But the dreams kept coming. Every night, I returned to the house. Every night, I walked those endless hallways with their locked doors, the ticking growing louder, always louder, until I reached the one door that was never fully closed. On the fifth night, I made it through. I pushed the door open, and the ticking stopped. The silence that followed was so sharp it hurt my ears. I stepped into the room, a small, windowless space with walls made of dark wood. In the center stood a table, and on the table sat the clock. My clock. Its hands were spinning wildly, blurring into nothing, even as the ticking remained silent. Across the table was a chair, and in the chair sat someone who looked just like me. I froze. My double tilted their heads slightly, watching me with an expression I couldn't place. They smiled, a small, faint smile that felt all wrong. "It's time," they said softly. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, the room around me pitch black. My heart pounded as I glanced at the clock on the shelf, its face dimly illuminated by the streetlight outside. The hands had moved. 3:18. I stared at it, my pulse thudding in my ears. It shouldn't have been possible. I hadn't touched the clock since that first night. But there it was, its hands perfectly aligned, the ticking steady and calm, as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the edge of my bed, watching the clock from across the room, daring it to do something. To move. To stop. To explain itself. But it just sat there, ticking softly, as if the last week of dreams and whispers and strange, silent rooms had been my imagination. The next morning, I packed it up. I told myself I'd return it to the thrift store, leave it there, and pretend I'd never found it. But when I got to the store, it wasn't open. The windows were covered in old newspapers, the door padlocked shut. There was no sign, no note, nothing to explain where the old woman with the giant glasses had gone. I tried knocking anyway, but the place was empty, and the sound of my fist against the door echoed too loudly in the quiet street. I brought the clock home because I didn't know what else to do with it. I shoved it into the back of my closet, wrapped in 2 layers of towels so I couldn't hear the ticking anymore. I slept better that night. No dreams, no strange houses or locked doors, just the simple, blissful silence of an ordinary night. But here's the thing. Sometimes, when I'm home alone, I swear I can still hear it. Faint, from somewhere deep in the walls. That soft, relentless ticking. I've checked the closet a dozen times, and the clock is always there, untouched. Its hands frozen at 3:18. I don't know what it means, or why it followed me. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that last night. If I'd sat down in the chair across from my double, listening to the clock as its hands spun faster and faster. Sometimes, I think about taking it back out, just to see, just to listen. But I don't. Not yet. Not until it's time. The clockmaker lived at the edge of town, in a house that looked as though it had been built from the bones of forgotten time. It was tall and narrow, its walls lined with gears, its windows smeared with dust so thick you could barely see the candlelight flickering within. If you got close enough, you'd hear it, the faint ticking of countless clocks, whispering in unison like 1,000 synchronized heartbeats. No one ever really saw him. Some said he was a recluse, others whispered he was a ghost. But every few weeks, without fail, people would find clocks left on their porches. They weren't ordinary clocks. Eliza found hers on a Sunday morning, nestled between her welcome mat and a muddy boot she'd forgotten to bring inside. The clock was small and delicate, carved from dark wood, with silver hands that moved in lazy, deliberate circles. At its center was a face. Not a number-marked clock face, but a tiny, shimmering eye, painted in exquisite detail. It seemed to watch her as she picked it up, though she told herself it was just her imagination. "Another one of his creations," said Mrs. Wallace, her nosy neighbor, leaning over the fence as if summoned. "You know what they say, don't you? Those clocks don't keep time. They take it." Eliza rolled her eyes. "It's just a clock." Mrs. Wallace didn't look convinced. "Then why does he give them away for free?" Eliza didn't answer. She brought the clock inside, turning it over in her hands. It didn't tick. It didn't do anything, really, other than sit there, unnervingly silent. Still, there was something beautiful about it, something deliberate. She placed it on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, figuring it would make a good conversation piece for guests. That night, Eliza dreamed. In her dream, she stood in a field of tall, swaying grass under a deep blue sky with no sun. A single clock tower rose in the distance, its spire piercing the clouds, its hands frozen at exactly 3:17. The grass rustled, though there was no wind. Eliza turned in a slow circle, and then she saw them. Figures, half hidden in the grass. Their faces were obscured, but their movements were sharp and deliberate, like puppets pulled by invisible strings. They were all holding clocks, clutching them tightly to their chests as if afraid to let go. One of them looked up suddenly, and though Eliza couldn't see its face, she knew it was staring at her. She woke with a jolt, heart pounding, sweat slick on her skin. The clock on the mantelpiece was ticking now, its silver hands spinning faster than they should. The little painted eye at its center gleamed faintly in the moonlight streaming through her window, and Eliza swore it blinked. She didn't sleep again that night. By morning, the clock had returned to silence. Eliza tried to ignore it, shoving the memory of the dream into the back of her mind. But things began to change. Small things at first. Her coffee would grow cold faster than usual. Her morning commute seemed to pass in an instant, yet the workday dragged on endlessly. The hours felt out of sync, slipping and stretching like melted wax. The second night, she dreamed again. This time, she stood inside the clock tower. Its gears moved slowly, groaning under some great invisible weight, and the sound of ticking echoed off the stone walls, so loud it made her teeth ache. A figure sat hunched over in the center of the room, its back to her. It looked like a man, though its limbs were far too long, and its hands, delicate and thin, worked tirelessly to repair a massive, broken clock. "Hello?" Eliza called, though her voice barely rose above the ticking. "Where am I?" The figure didn't turn, but its voice filled the space, sharp and metallic. "You've come too far." "What does that mean?" Eliza asked, stepping closer. The ticking seemed to grow louder with every step, until it was vibrating through her bones. The figure stopped moving. It tilted its head slightly, and though it still didn't look at her, she felt its attention like a weight. "The clock is hungry," it said. She woke again, this time to the sound of her own scream. The clock on the mantelpiece was gone. The space where it had sat was covered in a fine layer of black dust, as though it had burned away. Eliza felt her pulse racing, an icy dread curling through her stomach. She glanced at her phone. It was 3:17. The following day, Eliza returned to the clockmaker's house. It loomed at the edge of town like a forgotten relic, the faint ticking of unseen clocks leaking out through the walls. She hesitated at the doorstep, then pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside. The interior was worse than she had imagined. Clocks of every shape and size crowded every surface, mantels, shelves, even the floor, but none of them kept the same time. Some moved too fast, others barely moved at all. The air smelled of oil and old wood, and beneath it all, there was something else, a faint metallic tang, like blood. At the center of the room sat the clockmaker. He was an old man, his face lined and pale, his eyes hidden behind round, reflective glasses that caught the faint light from the lanterns on the walls. His long fingers worked on a delicate pocket watch, the tiny gears spilling across the table in front of him. He didn't look up as she entered. "You've returned it," he said, his voice low and mechanical. "What did you do to me?" Eliza demanded. "What is that clock?" The clockmaker looked up then, and the lenses of his glasses glinted gold, like clock faces turned to the light. "Time is a trade," he said. "You took, and now it takes." "I didn't take anything," she snapped. "I didn't ask for this." He tilted his head slightly, as though considering her. "But it chose you." "I don't want it. I want my time back," Eliza said, her voice shaking. The clockmaker rose slowly, and Eliza saw that his coat was stitched together from scraps of leather and fabric, as though he, too, had been pieced together over time. "Time cannot be given back," he said softly, stepping closer. "Only paid forward." The air around her grew heavy, thick with the hum of countless ticking clocks. Eliza's vision swam as the clockmaker held out his hand, revealing a new clock, identical to the one she'd received, except this one pulsed faintly with light. "It will pass to someone else," he said, "and you will be free." Eliza stared at the clock, her stomach twisting. "You want me to give it to someone else?" "A trade must be made," he said. Her hand trembled as she reached for the clock, the hum of its ticking growing louder, faster, as her fingers brushed its surface. She thought of her friends, her neighbors, the strangers she passed on the street. Who would she give it to? Could she? Or The clockmaker said softly, "You can keep it." "What happens if I keep it?" Eliza whispered. The clockmaker didn't answer, but he didn't have to. She already knew. She could feel it. The weight of the clock, the way its hunger pulled at the edges of her existence, as if it wanted to hollow her out completely. Her hand closed around the clock. The ticking stopped. I woke up to find my house had forgotten where it was. Outside my window, the neighborhood had vanished, replaced instead by an endless, rolling ocean that shimmered under a violet sky. The waves lapped gently against the edges of my porch, and when I stepped out to get a better look, I saw my mailbox floating like a tiny raft, bobbing up and down as if none of this were out of the ordinary. "Morning," the mailbox called, tipping slightly with a wave of its red flag. I blinked. "Are you talking?" I asked, though by now, I should really stop being surprised. "Only when necessary," it replied. "And right now, it feels polite to let you know you've drifted off course." I turned to look back at the house, which sat serenely on a small patch of earth that appeared to be tethered to nothing. The yard, now just a crescent of stubborn grass, had curled its edges up like it didn't trust the water not to soak through. How did this happen? I asked no one in particular. The ocean didn't answer. Instead, it sighed softly, and a ripple of light moved across its surface, as though the water was thinking about it. I went back inside and found my living room had made some adjustments to accommodate the new environment. The couch had grown life jackets and was floating about 2 feet off the floor like it was ready to set sail. My coffee table had sprouted oars. The rug rolled itself up neatly in one corner, muttering about water damage. I poured myself a cup of coffee, which thankfully was still coffee, and sat on the now hovering couch. "Okay," I said aloud. "Now what?" The house groaned faintly, like an old ship settling into the waves, and then it started to move. It wasn't dramatic, more of a gentle drift, the kind that rocks you to sleep if you don't pay attention, but we were definitely no longer stationary. I opened the front door again, holding onto the frame as the house swayed. In the distance, the water was changing, becoming less water and more something else. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the surface had taken on a texture, like silk that shimmered in a breeze. I thought I saw things moving beneath it, shapes that were too fluid to be fish and too large to be shadows. One of them surfaced briefly, and for a second, a massive, glassy eye blinked up at me before disappearing into the depths. I stepped back inside quickly. "Nope," I said to the couch. "Not dealing with that." By noon, the house had picked up speed, moving with purpose across the silk sea. The air inside buzzed faintly, like the walls were humming to themselves, and the windows fogged up with what looked like stars instead of condensation. I was halfway through a sandwich when the kitchen sink turned on by itself. Water gushed out, not clear, but gold, like liquid sunlight pooling in the basin. I stared at it. "Is this normal?" I asked. The faucet dripped once, thoughtfully, and then the golden water stilled. A voice echoed faintly from somewhere deep in the pipes. "Almost there." "Almost where?" I demanded, but the faucet didn't answer. The house lurched, tipping forward slightly, and I grabbed onto the fridge to steady myself. Outside the window, the ocean, or whatever it was, had begun to rise, lifting itself into massive hills and valleys that undulated like breathing lungs. The house sailed onward, and at the crest of one wave, I saw land. Not land like I knew it. No buildings, no roads. Just an island that looked like it had been plucked from someone's dream. The trees were tall and silver, their leaves catching the strange light and throwing it back as glittering fragments. Flowers the size of my head swayed in slow motion, their petals shifting colors with each movement. The ground pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat you could see. The house bumped gently into the island's edge, coming to a stop. I opened the door again, and this time a path of smooth stones unfurled in front of me, leading from the porch to the center of the island. I hesitated. What if I don't want to go? I asked aloud, half expecting an answer. The porch creaked beneath me, its wood stretching and sighing like it had been waiting for this moment for years. My mailbox floated back into view, bumping gently against the house. "You should go," it said. "Places like this don't come twice." I stepped onto the stones. They were warm underfoot, as if the island itself was alive and happy to see me. The moment I set foot on the path, the trees leaned slightly toward me, their branches parting just enough to reveal what lay at the center of the island. There, surrounded by a ring of glowing mushrooms, was a door. It wasn't attached to anything, just a door standing upright in the grass. It was deep red, with a brass handle that pulsed faintly like it was breathing. I approached slowly, the air thickening around me. It felt heavy with something I couldn't name. Possibility, maybe, or the weight of questions I hadn't thought to ask. The closer I got, the clearer it became that the door wasn't just a door. There was something on the other side, something waiting. Do I knock? I muttered to myself. You could, said a voice. I spun around to find a woman sitting on one of the stone steps, though she hadn't been there a second ago. She wore a coat made of feathers and a hat that seemed to shift shapes when I wasn't looking directly at it. Or, she continued, you could open it and see what happens. Most people knock, though. Politeness and all that. What's on the other side? I asked. She smiled, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if she had teeth or tiny constellations in her mouth. Depends who you ask. I turned back to the door. It seemed to watch me, its surface shimmering faintly like the silk sea I'd crossed. My hand reached for the handle before I'd fully made the decision to move. When my fingers touched it, the air around me held its breath. I glanced back at the woman. What if I don't want to open it? Her smile widened. Then you'll never know. The thought made something in me ache, though I couldn't say why. I turned back to the door, took a deep breath, and pushed it open. There was no blinding light, no dramatic fanfare, just a quiet rush of wind that smelled like places I hadn't been yet. I stepped through without looking back. On the other side, I found myself standing in a room filled with clocks. Each one was different, some grand and ornate, others small and delicate, all of them ticking in perfect, mesmerizing rhythm. In the center of the room stood a pedestal with a single clock resting on top of it. This one was mine. I knew it instantly, though I couldn't explain how. Its hands moved slower than they should have, and its face was scratched in places, like it had been dropped and repaired many times over. What is this place? I whispered. A reminder, the woman's voice echoed faintly, though she was nowhere to be seen. The clock on the pedestal ticked once, loud enough to shake the room. Its hands froze, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, slowly, the hands began to move backward. I woke up in my bed, my room completely still. Outside the window, the neighborhood had returned, familiar and ordinary. But on my nightstand sat a single silver leaf, glowing faintly in the early morning light. It began with a book that wasn't mine. I found it sitting on the kitchen table when I got home, squarely in the center, like someone had carefully placed it there. That didn't make sense. I lived alone. I locked my doors. But there it was, thick and heavy, with a leather cover so dark it seemed to drink the light. There was no title on the front, no author's name, only a strange embossed symbol. A circle surrounded by jagged lines, like a sun but wrong, as if it were mid-collapse. I looked around the apartment, searching for something. Footprints, a window left open, anything to explain how the book got there. But everything was in its place, exactly how I'd left it. Except for the book. I should have ignored it. I should have pushed it off the table and called someone, anyone. But instead, I sat down. My fingers brushed the cover, and it felt warm, as though someone had been holding it just moments before. When I opened it, a faint smell escaped, like rain on stone. The first page was blank, but the second wasn't. There, in small, slanted handwriting, was a sentence that made my skin prickle. You are the reader. Begin at the end. I turned the page, and my name was written in bold letters across the top, like a heading. My full name. The kind that appears only on passports or doctor's forms, too formal for anyone I knew to use. I felt cold, despite the heat radiating from the book. Below my name was a description of me. Where I grew up, my favorite food when I was 7, a scar I'd almost forgotten about on my left knee from falling off my bike. It was unsettlingly accurate. Then it got stranger. I read the first paragraph 3 times before I believed what it said. On the night of October 17th, You will find this book. You will open it despite your instincts, and at exactly 9:42 p.m., you will read this sentence. Someone is knocking at your door. The knock came. 3 slow, deliberate raps, so loud it rattled the silverware in the drawer. I jumped to my feet, the book snapping shut in my hands. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the door. Another knock followed, steady and patient. I didn't move. I couldn't. The book's words echoed in my head. Someone is knocking at your door. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to step forward. When I reached the door, I hesitated. Who's there? My voice sounded thin. The hallway outside my apartment was silent. I glanced at the peephole, but for some reason, I didn't want to look through it. Instead, I cracked the door open, just a sliver. The hallway was empty. No footsteps, no voices, just empty. And yet, as I closed the door and turned back toward the kitchen table, I saw it. Another book, identical to the first, sitting beside the one I'd already opened. I walked to it slowly, heart pounding in my ears. The 2 books sat side by side, almost touching. I opened the new one, and this time, the words were written differently. Messy, hurried, like someone had scrawled them with shaking hands. Do not trust the first book. It lies. My mouth went dry. I looked at the first book, its leather cover gleaming faintly. My instinct was to throw them both out, to burn them if I could. But the words stayed lodged in my head. It lies. I flipped through the second book, looking for more. The pages were filled with entries, all of them starting with my name. They told stories, moments that hadn't happened yet, but felt too close to truth to dismiss. Things I hadn't done, things I would do. And every few pages, there was a warning, scrawled in the margins like a whispered secret. It's watching. It sees you now. Don't read the last page. I snapped the book shut, while rising in my throat. I didn't want to know what was on the last page. I grabbed both books and stuffed them into a duffel bag, as though that might dull their weight. I needed to get out of the apartment, out of whatever was happening. I threw on a jacket and slung the bag over my shoulder, but as I reached for the door handle, the lights flickered. A whisper brushed the back of my neck. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a word. It was a presence, as though something immense was leaning close, testing the air around me. I turned slowly, and the lights went out completely. In the dark, I heard the sound of pages turning. The books. I fumbled for my phone, shaking as I turned on the flashlight. The beam wobbled across the room, landing on the table. The books were open again, pages fluttering on their own, faster and faster as though invisible hands were flipping through them. I didn't know what to do, so I screamed. The pages stopped. The room went silent. And then, in the harsh beam of my flashlight, I saw it. The first book lay open to a single page, perfectly still. My name was at the top again, followed by one line. It's behind you. Every muscle in my body locked. I didn't want to turn around, but I felt it again. The weight of something enormous, something vast and hungry, leaning in. The whisper came again, closer this time, like wind slipping through cracks in stone. I turned. The flashlight went out. I don't remember what I saw. Maybe I didn't see anything at all, but I felt it, and that was worse. It was cold and infinite, like falling into the space between stars. I stumbled backward, my hand catching the edge of the table. I grabbed blindly for the books, my fingers digging into leather, and ran. I don't know how long I ran or where I went. When I finally stopped, I was sitting on a bench in a park I didn't recognize, the duffel bag clutched to my chest. Dawn was breaking. The city around me was waking up, ordinary and unaware, like nothing had happened. I opened the bag, half expecting the books to be gone, but they were still there. Both of them. I took out the second one, the warning book, and flipped through it desperately, searching for answers. Toward the back, in handwriting that looked shakier than before, I found a single note. If you're reading this, it's too late to run. The only way out is the ending. I stared at the last page. I didn't want to turn to it. I didn't want to know what it said, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. My fingers trembled as I turned the final page. There, in perfect, calm handwriting, was one sentence. The reader closes the book. I stared at the words. They stared back. I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. But my hands moved on their own, closing the book with a final, echoing thud. The air shifted, like a held breath being released. When I looked up, I was home again. The table was empty. The books were gone. Outside the window, the city sounded normal again. Cars, voices, life. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still hammering. But every now and then, I catch the smell of rain on stone. And when I turn around too quickly, I swear I see a shadow, just at the edge of my vision, watching, waiting. I had always hated the sound of the train whistle at night. It was distant, almost hollow, carried on the wind like a ghost calling out. I'd lie in bed and wait for it, like clockwork, somewhere just past midnight. A sound that didn't belong to any schedule I could find. There hadn't been trains running through town in years. Not since the tracks were torn up and the station turned into a condemned relic. But the whistle still came, and every time it did, it sounded closer. I first heard the story from an old man who lived near the edge of town. He was the sort of man you'd find at a corner table of a diner, nursing black coffee and staring too long out the window. He had a name, but no one used it anymore. We all called him Tracks, because he claimed to have worked the railroads when he was young. "Train still runs," he told me once, his voice like gravel grinding in his throat. I'd stopped to help him after I found him on the side of the road, his hands shaking as he tried to roll a cigarette. I remember laughing, the way teenagers do when they think they know better. "No trains here, Tracks. There haven't been in forever." He gave me this look, hard and tired, the way someone looks at you when they know you don't understand. "It doesn't stop for everyone," he said, "just the ones it wants." That should have been the end of it, a creepy story from a creepy man. But that whistle kept coming, night after night, closer than it had any right to be. I started sleeping with the window cracked open, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. The wind, I thought, just the wind. But the more I heard it, the less it sounded like wind. It wasn't just the whistle. It was the hum of wheels on tracks, the rhythmic clatter of something enormous moving in the dark. Then, one night, it came. I was awake, staring at the ceiling, when the whistle cut through the silence. My window was open, and I could feel it, like the air had thickened, vibrating with the weight of something vast and unseen. I got out of bed and looked out into the night, my backyard swallowed by shadows. I don't know what made me put on my sneakers and step outside, but I did. The whistle blew again, louder now, closer, and my heart began to race. There were no tracks, no station, but as I walked toward the field that stretched behind the woods, I could see it. A thin line of silver gleaming faintly in the moonlight, stretching into the distance where nothing had been before. My feet moved before my mind could catch up, like something was pulling me forward. I stumbled through tall grass and weeds until I found myself standing on the platform. It shouldn't have been there. The station was small, brick crumbling and covered in ivy, its paint peeling and windows boarded up. But it wasn't abandoned, not tonight. The lanterns were lit, glowing an eerie yellow, and the benches were filled with people sitting perfectly still. They didn't look up as I approached, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats and dark veils. The silence was unbearable. I could hear my heartbeat, quick and frantic, and I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. Then I heard it, the train. It started as a hum, deep and low, shaking the ground beneath me. A light appeared in the distance, growing brighter, closer, until the train roared into view, its engine massive and black, its wheels screeching against the tracks. It slowed as it reached the platform, steam hissing into the night. The engine was covered in grime, its sides streaked with rust, but its headlamp burned with an unnatural light, like fire trapped behind glass. I stood frozen as the train came to a stop. Doors opened with a heavy groan, and that's when I noticed the conductor. He stood perfectly still at the far end of the platform, wearing an old-fashioned uniform that was far too clean. His cap sat low, shadowing his face, but his eyes glowed faintly, like two embers in the dark. "Tickets," he said, his voice echoing through the night. No one moved. The passengers on the benches stayed where they were, their hands folded neatly in their laps. I thought, for a moment, that he might ignore me entirely. But then he turned his head, slowly, and his glowing eyes fixed on mine. "You're late." I stumbled backward, every instinct screaming at me to run. I don't have a ticket," I managed to say, my voice small and hoarse. "You do," he replied, raising one gloved hand. In it was a small slip of paper, perfectly white, with my name written across the top. I didn't reach for it, but somehow it was already in my hand. The paper felt too warm, like it had been sitting in sunlight for hours, and I could see writing on it. Tiny, impossible words scrawled in looping ink that I couldn't read. "Bored," the conductor said, stepping aside. I didn't want to. I swear I didn't. But my legs carried me forward, and before I knew it, I was standing inside the train car. The doors groaned shut behind me, and the whistle blew again, deafening this time, rattling my bones. The train lurched forward, and I fell into one of the seats. The passengers around me sat perfectly still, facing forward, their faces still hidden. I didn't belong here. I knew that. But no one spoke. No one moved. Outside the windows, the world was pitch black. No lights, no trees, nothing but darkness rushing by. After what felt like hours, I noticed something strange. The seats across from me were empty. I knew they hadn't been before. I turned to look behind me, and the row of passengers was gone. The train car was empty. The conductor's voice filled the silence. "Next stop," he said, the words lingering too long in the air. "Where are we going?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The train didn't answer. I looked back out the window, and that's when I saw them. Shapes in the dark, keeping pace with the train. They moved on all fours, their limbs too long, their hands clawing at the windows. They didn't have faces, just smooth, pale skin stretched tight over empty skulls. One of them turned toward me. Its head tilted, and even without eyes, I could feel it looking. I scrambled to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The train was moving faster now, the sound of the engine deafening, the whistle shrieking like it was laughing at me. "Let me off," I screamed, pounding on the door. The conductor appeared at the far end of the car, his eyes still burning. "We don't stop for those who didn't listen," he said. I woke up in the field at sunrise, the train gone, the platform vanished. The tracks were just a faint impression in the dirt, already fading. I stumbled home, my clothes damp with dew and my hands still shaking. The ticket was still in my pocket. It's been 3 weeks, and I still hear the whistle every night. It's closer now, louder. Last night, I looked out the window and saw the headlamp burning in the distance, its firelight flickering through the trees. The train is coming back for me. I know it is. I don't know what happens when it stops, but I don't think it matters. I don't think I'll have a choice. The ticket's still in my pocket, and when I hold it up to the light, I can see the words now. Final destination. Let me tell you about the day the rain fell upward. I know how it sounds, crazy, impossible, like the kind of thing you'd hear from someone who spent too much time alone with their own thoughts. But I promise you, I was there. I saw it happen, and no one can convince me it wasn't real. It started like any other rainy afternoon. The sky was a heavy shade of gray, the kind that presses down on you like an unwanted hand on your shoulder. I'd been holed up in my favorite cafe, a little hole-in-the-wall place with mismatched furniture and a barista who always spelled my name wrong in increasingly creative ways. That day, I was Clarence. Close enough, I guess. The rain had started as a soft drizzle, tapping gently against the windows. By the time I finished my coffee, it was coming down in sheets, turning the streets into mirrors. I didn't mind. Rain had always been comforting to me, like white noise for the soul. I pulled up my hood, stepped outside, and immediately regretted it. My sneakers were soaked within seconds, and my breath turned to fog as I muttered curses to no one in particular. And then I noticed something strange. The raindrops around me slowed. I don't mean the rain stopped, no, it slowed. Like someone had grabbed the world's dial and turned the rain to half speed. I watched as a droplet hit the ground, bounced, and then just hung there, suspended in the air, as though gravity had decided to take a coffee break. I blinked. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe I was just seeing things. Maybe I'd been staring too hard at the pavement, and my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then another droplet rose, and another, and another. Within seconds, the rain wasn't falling down anymore. It was rising, upward, lifting off the pavement like a movie in reverse. The street turned into a ballet of water, droplets glimmering like liquid stars as they floated toward the sky. People around me had stopped in their tracks, necks craned, eyes wide. Some shouted. Others just stood there, stunned silent. "Do you see this?" I said to a man in a soaked business suit. He nodded slowly, eyes fixed upward. "It's like," he started, then trailed off, as though no words could do it justice. I stood there, mesmerized, as the rain streamed upward in shimmering arcs. Umbrellas were useless now. People were snapping photos, filming videos, calling friends. A little girl next to me let go of her mom's hand and held her palm up to the sky. A raindrop hovered over her hand like it was considering her offer before darting away. "This is not normal," someone muttered behind me. "It has to be a trick, right? Some kind of optical illusion?" But it wasn't. I could feel it. Something bigger than us was happening, something beyond science or logic. The air buzzed with a strange energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. Then I heard it, a hum. Faint at first, like the sound of a distant tuning fork, but growing louder. It wasn't coming from the people, or the buildings, or the cars stalled on the streets. It was coming from the sky. I looked up, and for the first time, I noticed the clouds. They weren't normal clouds. They were swirling, slowly, deliberately, like they were alive, pulling the water toward them. But in the center, just above the tallest buildings, the clouds were parting, revealing something vast and dark behind them. It wasn't a hole. It was the doorway, a doorway to somewhere else. The hum grew louder, rattling my teeth. The little girl who'd reached for the raindrops pointed at the sky and whispered, "It's calling them back?" I don't know why those words sent chills down my spine, but they did, calling them back. The rain was rising faster now, streams of water racing toward the sky like they couldn't wait to leave us behind. A man next to me tried to grab a rising droplet, only to have it dart away from his fingers. It didn't want to be touched. None of it did. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the hum stopped. The doorway in the sky snapped shut like a lid, and the clouds fell still. The rising water hung for one breathless moment, thousands of glimmering droplets frozen in the air, before they crashed back down all at once. It was like being caught in a tidal wave. I stumbled backward, drenched head to toe, water flooding the street as though the sky had emptied an entire ocean onto us. People screamed, scrambling for higher ground, and I found myself pressed against the cafe's brick wall, watching as the rain returned to normal. No hum, no floating water, just rain. Ordinary, boring rain. The man in the business suit was soaked, his hair plastered to his face. He looked at me, eyes wild. "Did that just? Did you see?" "I saw," I said. We stood there for a long time, silent except for the sound of rain falling, downward, the way it was supposed to. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The news was flooded with reports of atmospheric anomalies and optical illusions caused by light refraction. Scientists appeared on TV with long explanations about weather patterns and inversions, but none of it made sense. People shared their videos online, grainy footage of rain defying gravity, but the videos always cut off just before the clouds opened up. Every time someone tried to film the doorway, their camera glitched. It was like the sky didn't want to be caught on film. And then, within a week, the whole thing was forgotten. People moved on. They always do. But not me. I still think about it. About the hum in the air, the doorway behind the clouds, the rain that didn't want to stay here. It felt like a message, though I couldn't tell you what the message was. Sometimes, when it rains, I'll stand outside and hold my hand up to the sky, waiting for a raindrop to hesitate, waiting for it to rise. It hasn't happened again. Not yet. But I keep waiting, because I know what I saw. I know the rain wanted to go somewhere else, and I can't shake the feeling that one day, it might not come back. So, what about you? Have you ever seen something so impossible, so wrong, that it made you question the rules of the world? Because I promise you, Once you see the sky open up, you'll never look at rain the same way again. I woke up to sunlight spilling through my curtains, birds singing, and the faint taste of a forgotten dream lingering on my tongue. Everything felt normal, except when I went to rub my eyes. I saw the words scrawled in delicate, inky black script across my skin. Where do the missing days go? I sat up, blinking hard. It wasn't smudged like I'd written it in my sleep. It was precise, as though someone else had taken my hand and carefully traced the question there. I tried to wash it off, scrubbing at the letters with soap until my skin turned pink, but the ink didn't budge. Weird, I thought. But I had things to do: work, emails, grocery lists. Life was full of distractions. So I ignored it, or at least I tried to. At first, nothing else was strange. The world spun on as it always did. Coffee cups, car horns, waiting in line behind people who couldn't decide on their order. But by noon, something felt off. I couldn't remember yesterday. Not just the details, but the entire day gone. When I tried to recall what I had done, it was like running my hand through water. There was nothing to grab onto. I knew the date. I knew where I'd gone to sleep last night. But the hours before that? Blank. I checked my phone for photos, texts, anything. Nothing new. It was as if my life had skipped a beat. By evening, I was staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, rolling the question over and over in my mind. Where do the missing days go? The ink on my hand still looked fresh, as if it had just been written. And then I heard it. A tap 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 at my window. I froze. My apartment is on the 4th floor, and there's no fire escape. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound. There was someone standing on the other side of the glass. They shouldn't have been able to stand there, but they were. A man in a perfectly tailored black suit, his face pale and sharp like it had been carved from marble. He smiled. Not a friendly smile, but something else, something thin and precise. He raised one long, pale finger and tapped again. Tap, tap, tap. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream, but I could see him clearly now. His eyes were mismatched, one a piercing silver, the other an endless black. He mouthed a word slowly, deliberately, "Come." Then he pointed down. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the street. I didn't remember grabbing my coat or leaving the apartment. The man was there, now standing under a lamppost that flickered like it didn't know whether to shine or die. "You're late," he said. His voice was smooth and quiet, but it echoed faintly, like we were inside a vast cavern. "Who are you?" I croaked, shivering despite the lack of wind. He didn't answer. Instead, he extended his hand toward me, palm up. Sitting in the center of his hand was a key, a small, black key with a twisted, spiral shape. "There's not much time. You've misplaced something." What did I lose? He tilted his head, almost pityingly. "You already know." I didn't, though. At least, not at first. But when I looked at the key, I felt it, a hollow ache, somewhere deep inside me. Something was missing, something important. My hand twitched involuntarily, and before I knew it, I'd taken the key from his palm. The man's smile widened. "Good. The door is waiting." "What door?" He didn't answer, because suddenly we weren't on the street anymore. We were in a hallway that seemed to stretch forever in both directions. The walls were covered in peeling, floral wallpaper. The floor was dark wood, scratched and warped, and spaced evenly along the hallway were dozens of doors. The man gestured forward. "Find it." "Find what?" "Your lost day." I turned to demand answers, but he was already gone. The hallway felt even quieter without him, like the air itself was holding its breath. The only sound was my own footsteps as I walked to the first door. It was tall and narrow, made of red-painted wood with a brass handle. I pressed the key against the lock, but it didn't fit. I tried the next door, and the next. Each one was different. A door of frosted glass, a door covered in moss, a door that seemed to be breathing softly, in and out. None of them opened, until the 13th door. This one was smaller, barely taller than me, and carved from black stone. The moment the key touched the lock, the door shivered and creaked open an inch. Cold air spilled out, carrying the faint scent of rain and something metallic. I stepped inside. The room was enormous, too big to exist behind a door. It stretched endlessly in every direction, and above me hung a sky, starless and dark. The ground was covered in shallow water that reflected everything like a mirror, and in the center of the room stood a table. On the table was a glass jar. Inside the jar was me, a smaller version of me, curled up like I was asleep. The tiny figure's chest rose and fell, and a faint light pulsed from somewhere deep inside it, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I knew, without being told, that this was my missing day. The moment I stepped closer, the water beneath me rippled, and I heard a sound, a whisper, soft and urgent, like 100 voices speaking at once. I couldn't make out the words, but they filled my head, pressing against my thoughts like a rising tide. I reached for the jar. The instant my fingers touched it, the whispers stopped. The room held its breath, and then the glass shattered. The tiny figure inside, the piece of me, opened its eyes. They glowed faintly, silver and black, and before I could react, it lunged forward and pressed its hand against my chest. Everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in my bed. The words were gone from my hand, and the sun was streaming through the window like nothing had ever happened. But I remembered. I remembered the hallway, the jar, the feeling of something rushing back into me, something I'd lost without realizing it. I picked up my phone and checked the date. It was yesterday. No, today. Time had folded back on itself, rewinding to where I'd gone missing. And though everything looked the same, I felt different, like I'd been put back together, but not quite in the right way. On my nightstand sat the black key, and somewhere, faintly, I heard a tap at the window. A perfectly ordinary clock, hanging on the wall of my grandmother's house. I'd seen it 100 times growing up, an old wooden thing, dark mahogany with little brass gears peeking out behind the glass. Its pendulum swung gently, back and forth, a sound that had always blended into the hum of her kitchen. I hadn't thought about it in years, not until she passed and I found myself back in that house, surrounded by the stale smell of mothballs and forgotten memories. The clock was still there, of course, ticking away like it didn't care that the woman who'd owned it was gone. I'd come to sort through her things, though the house felt like it was sorting through me. Her furniture seemed bigger now, looming in the corners. The floral wallpaper curled slightly at the seams, like it was trying to peel itself away. Even the shadows were heavier here. I kept telling myself it was just grief playing tricks on me. That's what people say, isn't it? That grief makes the world seem strange, warping the edges of reality like heat rising off pavement. I first noticed something was wrong when the clock chimed. It wasn't supposed to chime, not anymore. I remembered my grandmother saying the chime mechanism had broken years ago, but as I was boxing up her teacups, each painted with delicate flowers I swear she never actually drank out of, the clock let out a low, metallic bong that made my hands freeze. I turned to look at it. The pendulum was swinging faster now, not wildly, but too quickly to be normal, like it had forgotten how time was supposed to work. I stood there, staring at it, trying to convince myself it was just malfunctioning. That's all. Old clocks break. They misbehave. But then the pendulum stopped, mid-swing, frozen at a perfect angle. The ticking stopped too, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like the whole house had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. Then the hand started moving backward. At first, it was slow. The minute hand dragged itself counterclockwise, scraping faintly as it went. I took a step toward it, my shoes creaking on the floorboards. I don't know why I didn't run. I should have, but I didn't. I just watched, rooted to the spot, as the minute hand gained speed. Faster, faster, until it was spinning like a child's toy. The gears inside the clock whirred, and the pendulum swung backward in slow, deliberate arcs, like it was winding itself up for something. I wanted to move, to leave the room, to stop watching, but I couldn't. And then the clock stopped completely. I don't mean it froze again. I mean it stopped everything. The hum of the house disappeared. The wind outside fell silent. Even the faint buzz of electricity, the sound you don't know you're hearing until it's gone, that was missing too. My ears rang from the emptiness. I turned, looking around the room, and that's when I saw the doorway. It wasn't supposed to be there. My grandmother's living room had always led into a hallway that took you to the kitchen. But now, right where the old armchair used to be, there was a narrow doorway. No frame, no trim, just a rectangular opening cut into the wall, its edges uneven and raw, like someone had hacked it out with a knife. Beyond it was darkness. Not the kind of darkness you find in a basement or a closet, but a darkness that felt solid, as if it had been poured into place. I should have left, should have walked out the front door, called someone, done anything other than what I did. But that doorway felt like a magnet pulling at my chest. I stepped toward it. The closer I got, the colder the air became, sharp and metallic, like breathing in ice and blood. I paused at the threshold, staring into the blackness. I thought I heard something move in there, a faint, dragging sound, like something pulling itself across a floor. "Hello?" I said, my voice too small. The sound stopped. I should have taken that as a warning, but instead, I stepped through. It felt like walking through water, thick and resistant, pressing in on all sides. My grandmother's house vanished behind me, replaced by an endless stretch of nothing. I turned, but the doorway was gone. I was alone in the dark. I could hear my breathing, shaky and loud, echoing back at me from somewhere far away. I walked forward, because what else was there to do? My footsteps were muffled, like the ground beneath me was padded. I don't know how long I walked. There was no sense of time. No markers to tell me if I'd moved 10 feet or 1,000. Then, far ahead of me, a light flickered. A faint, pulsing glow, like a candle fighting against the dark. I started toward it, my pace quickening. The light grew brighter as I approached, and eventually, I saw its source. It was another clock. It stood on a pedestal in the center of the void, tall and grand, its face glowing faintly gold. This clock was pristine, every gear polished, every line sharp. Its hands were moving, but they weren't telling time. They were spinning, not forward or backward but inward, like they were folding into themselves. I stared at it, mesmerized. Something about it felt alive, its movements deliberate. That's when I noticed the shadows gathering around it. They weren't human, but they were shaped like people, tall and thin, their edges bleeding into the darkness. They stood perfectly still, ringed around the clock like sentinels. Their heads turned slowly toward me in unison, though they had no faces, just smooth, featureless voids where their features should have been. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The hands of the clock slowed. I could feel it watching me, though I didn't know how. The shadows began to move, their limbs unfolding in jerky, unnatural motions as they stepped closer, closing the circle. I backed away, my chest tight with panic, but the darkness behind me had thickened, trapping me in place. The clock let out a sound, a deep, resonant hum that I could feel in my bones. The shadows stopped. For a long moment, everything was still. Then the clock spoke. It didn't speak with words. It spoke with time itself, each tick reverberating through my mind like a whisper I couldn't quite hear. I understood it, though. It was telling me something. A bargain. An exchange. Something about forever. I shook my head, stumbling back, my voice trembling. I don't want this. I didn't come here on purpose. The clock's hum grew louder, vibrating the air around me. The shadows stepped closer. I want to go back, I said. Please. The hands of the clock slowed again, grinding to a halt. A moment passed. Then, faintly, I heard a sound behind me, the soft ticking of my grandmother's clock. I turned and saw a doorway cut into the darkness, glowing faintly at the edges. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, the hum of the clock growing deafening, the shadows closing in. I leapt through the doorway, my body tumbling forward, and landed hard on a wooden floor. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my grandmother's house. The living room was exactly as it had been. Faded wallpaper, heavy furniture, the scent of dust and old fabric. I turned to look at the clock on the wall. It was still, silent, its hands frozen at 3:13. I left the house that night, locked the door behind me, and never looked back. But the ticking followed me. At first, it was faint, just at the edge of hearing, like the hum of electricity. Then it grew louder. Sometimes I wake up at night, and find the hands of my alarm clock spinning backward. Sometimes I hear a knock in the walls, soft and rhythmic, like a pendulum swinging. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the shadows waiting. It started with a message on my doorstep, scribbled on the back of a postcard and tied with a piece of twine to a small, unmarked wooden box. Meet me at 8:03 p.m. under the clock tower. Come ready for a puzzle. The rest will make sense, I promise. It had no signature, but I knew it was him. His notes always had this balance of playfulness and precision, like they were part of some invisible blueprint only he could see. We'd met a month earlier at a lecture about forgotten languages, because, apparently, that's a thing two people can accidentally bond over. And since then, every interaction with him had felt like wandering into a storybook I hadn't realized I was reading. At exactly 8:03, I found him leaning against the base of the clock tower, holding what looked like an old leather-bound journal. He looked up when I approached, that lopsided grin of his appearing like clockwork. "You're here." "I am," I said, hands in my pockets, though I'm still deciding if I'm walking into a scavenger hunt or a cult initiation. He laughed. "Only one way to find out." Then he handed me the journal. "What's this?" "Tonight's map," he said simply. I opened it to find pages filled with sketches and handwritten notes. The first page had a small, precise drawing of the clock tower and an arrow pointing to a row of lampposts that lined the street. Beside it was written, "Step 1, follow the light." "Is this a game?" I asked, glancing up at him. "Not a game," he said, falling into step beside me. "An adventure." We followed the lampposts, which cast long golden shadows across the cobblestone street. After a few minutes, I noticed tiny chalk marks drawn onto the ground. Symbols, arrows, a spiral here and there. They matched the sketches in the journal. "You made these," I said, crouching to inspect one. "Maybe," he said casually, as though he hadn't spent what must have been hours creating this whole setup. The chalk trail led us to the edge of the river, where a narrow stone bridge arched over the water. He paused, holding out a hand to stop me. "Okay," he said, pointing to the journal again. "Now it's your turn." I flipped to the next page. Another drawing, this time of the bridge, but split into 4 sections. Above it were the words, "Listen carefully. Each step has a sound." "What does that mean?" I asked. "Figure it out," he said, eyes twinkling. I stared at him for a moment before stepping onto the bridge. To my surprise, there were small metallic chimes hidden beneath the stone planks, and with every step, a different sound rang out. Soft, bell-like tones, each step playing a note I hadn't expected to hear. I turned back to him, my face lit up with a grin. "You set up a musical bridge?" He shrugged, but he looked proud. "You're the first person to hear it." "First? You mean this is brand new?" he finished. "It's been under construction for months, but nobody's explored it like this yet. Not until you." Something about the way he said that made my stomach flip, like I'd been let in on a secret no one else knew. When we reached the end of the bridge, the journal's next page revealed another clue. "Find the tree with a door." "A tree with a door?" I asked, skeptical. "You'll know it when you see it," he said, starting down a path that led into a small grove of trees. We wandered beneath branches that swayed in the evening breeze, and then I saw it, a massive, gnarled tree with a hollowed-out trunk. Someone had carefully fashioned a small wooden door, complete with a doorknob and hinges, right into the base. "Okay," I said, laughing as I crouched in front of it. "This is objectively adorable." "Check inside," he urged. I opened the tiny door to find a tin lantern with a candle already flickering inside. Next to it sat a folded paper crane, its wings perfectly creased. I picked it up carefully, unfolding it to find a note written in his same neat handwriting. "Not all doors lead to endings. Some just take you further in." "What does that mean?" I asked, glancing up at him. He smiled softly, crouching next to me. "It means there's more to come." Together, we lit the lantern, its glow casting golden light against the bark. I looked at him, realizing how much thought he'd poured into tonight. Not to impress me, but to create something, share something. "Why all this?" I asked, finally voicing the question. He tilted his head, considering. Because most people think adventures are about big, sweeping things, running away, chasing danger, finding treasure. But I think the best ones are quieter. They're about noticing details, about sharing moments you don't forget. Something in my chest tightened in the best way, like I just stumbled into a memory being created in real time. He stood and offered me his hand. Ready for the last stop? Lead the way. He guided me to the top of a small hill where an old blanket was spread out, surrounded by glass jars holding candles, like a constellation pulled down to earth. Above us, the stars had appeared, scattered across the sky, impossibly clear. This is Phase 4? I teased, sitting down beside him. This is Phase 4, he confirmed, lying back on the blanket. You did well tonight, by the way. Very Sherlock Holmes of you. Thank you, I said, lying back too. But next time, I get to plan the clues. Deal, he said softly. We sat there for a long time, letting the quiet wrap around us, broken only by the occasional hum of the river below. Eventually, he spoke. You know what's cool about stars? What? By the time we see them, some of them are already gone. Light travels so far to get here. We're looking at their past. And somehow, even knowing that, they're still beautiful. I turned my head to look at him, like a postcard from the universe. He smiled. Exactly. We didn't say much after that. We didn't need to. The night stretched on, stars above, candles flickering below, and a journal filled with small, beautiful moments sitting between us. When I got home that night, I found something tucked into my coat pocket. Another folded paper crane. This one read, Adventures don't end. They just turn the page. See you soon. And I couldn't wait to see what came next. Have you ever had a date so magical that it felt like it was pulling you into a story only the two of you could write? The first time the clock in the attic chimed, it was 2:14 a.m. I remember because I was wide awake, scrolling on my phone and debating whether to grab a midnight snack. I didn't even know there was a clock in the attic. I'd only moved in a week earlier, and the house, a creaky old Victorian I'd gotten for a suspiciously low price, was still full of mysteries. Most of the doors stuck, the light switches didn't work in half the rooms, and the floorboards moaned like they had secrets they wanted to spill. But that night, the house was quiet, until it wasn't. The chime wasn't loud. It was soft, almost musical, like the kind of clock you'd find in your grandmother's house, the one that only works when it feels like it. I paused, my thumb hovering over the screen of my phone, and strained to listen. Bong. Another chime, low and hollow, reverberating through the stillness of the night. I frowned. The attic was empty, or at least it was supposed to be. When I toured the house, the realtor hadn't even bothered to show me the attic, just waved dismissively and said it was storage space. I assumed it was filled with dust and cobwebs and maybe a dead squirrel or two. Certainly not antique clocks that chimed at strange hours. The rational part of me thought it was just the house settling. Old houses made noises, right? But there was another part of me, the part that grew up watching horror movies alone in the dark, that whispered, "Don't go up there." Naturally, I ignored it. Grabbing my phone for light, I climbed the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of wood and mildew grew stronger. At the top, I reached for the doorknob and hesitated. It was cold to the touch. I pushed it open. The attic was as you'd expect, dusty, cramped, and filled with forgotten things. Old trunks, a stack of yellowed newspapers, a broken rocking chair. The floor was littered with stray nails and warped floorboards, and the faint scent of something metallic hung in the air. But no clock. I swept the room with the flashlight on my phone, searching for the source of the noise. Nothing. The only sound was my own breathing, heavy and too loud in the stillness. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe the sound had come from outside, or maybe my overactive imagination was playing tricks on me. I closed the attic door and went back to bed, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The second time the clock chimed, it was exactly 2:14 a.m. again. This time, I was ready. I'd spent the entire day thinking about it, half convinced the whole thing had been a weird dream. But when the first chime echoed through the house, I was already sitting up in bed. Bong. The sound was deeper this time, almost mournful. It wasn't coming from outside. It was definitely coming from the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and a heavy wrench from the toolbox I'd been using to fix the leaky sink in the kitchen. My heart was pounding as I climbed the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath my feet making me jump. The attic door was slightly ajar. I didn't remember leaving it that way. The smell hit me first, stronger this time, metallic and sharp, like rust mixed with damp earth. I pushed the door open, and there it was. The clock. It stood in the center of the attic, tall and ornate, its dark wood gleaming despite the thick layer of dust that coated everything else. The face was covered in elaborate gold filigree, and the hands pointed to 2:14. Beneath the face, a small pendulum swung slowly back and forth, though the clock itself made no sound. I stared at it, my brain scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. This clock hadn't been here the night before. I was sure of it. As I stepped closer, I noticed something etched into the wood just above the clock face. To remember is to invite. I didn't like that. I didn't like that at all. The air in the attic felt heavier now, thick and oppressive, pressing down on me like the weight of 1,000 eyes. I reached out to touch the clock, and the moment my fingers brushed the wood, the pendulum stopped. The house groaned. Not the kind of groan old wood makes when it shifts, but something deeper, something alive. And then the chime came again, louder than before. Bong, bong, bong. It didn't stop. The sound reverberated through my skull, drowning out every rational thought. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight, and the beam spun wildly across the room. For a split second, the light caught something in the corner of the attic, a shape that shouldn't have been there. A figure. It was tall and thin, with limbs that stretched too long for its body. Its face was obscured by shadow, but I could see its mouth, wide and grinning, filled with teeth that gleamed like broken glass. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. The flashlight flickered and went out. The clock stopped chiming. I don't remember how I got back downstairs. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on the floor of my bedroom, clutching the wrench so tightly my knuckles were white. The house was silent again, but the silence felt wrong, like the quiet before a storm. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called the realtor to ask about the house's history. She seemed surprised by my question but said she'd look into it and get back to me. That evening, she called back. "Are you sure you want to know?" she asked. Her voice was hesitant, almost afraid. "Yes," I said. There was a long pause before she spoke again. The house used to belong to the Grayson family. They lived there for 3 generations. The last member of the family, a man named Edward Grayson, disappeared in 1947. They never found him. Disappeared? I repeated, my throat dry. They said he spent all his time in the attic, working on something. No one ever figured out what it was. I hung up before she could say more. That night, the clock chimed again. This time, it didn't stop. I can hear it now, echoing through the house, filling every corner with its mournful toll. I haven't gone back to the attic. I don't think I can, but I know the clock is waiting for me, and so is whatever's standing in the shadows. Every Monday at exactly 10:04 p.m., we wrote letters to strangers. Not emails, not texts, letters. Real ones, with paper, ink smudges, and envelopes we sealed with candle wax like we were royal scribes or secret messengers from another century. It started during one of those particularly monotonous weeks where every day felt like a carbon copy of the last. She'd been sprawled upside down on the couch, her legs flopped over the backrest, flipping idly through an old notebook of mine. "You know what's weird?" she said suddenly, voice muffled because her face was half buried in a pillow. "What?" "Nobody writes letters anymore. Like, actual letters. People just blurt their thoughts into the void of the internet and hit send. But letters? Letters are magic." She sat up, grinning like she'd stumbled on the secret to life. "Let's write some." "To who?" "Who cares? Strangers. People we'll never meet. We'll send little pieces of ourselves out into the world and let them land wherever they're meant to." I thought it was ridiculous, but there was something electric in her excitement, like she was about to crack open a door neither of us knew existed. So that night, We sat at the kitchen table with a stack of cheap stationery and 2 fountain pens I dug out of a forgotten drawer, and we started writing. The first letter went to someone named Eleanor. I don't know why we picked the name. It just felt like a good name for a stranger. "Dear Eleanor," she began, "I hope you're having the kind of day where your coffee is exactly the right temperature and someone randomly compliments your shoes." I watched as she filled the page with mundane joys. Wind that doesn't tangle your hair. A song you'd forgotten but remembered just in time to sing along. The smell of laundry still warm from the dryer. "It's nice," she said as she sealed the envelope. "It feels like we're talking to the universe." From then on, Monday nights belonged to the strangers. Each week, we'd sit at the table with pens and tea and an ever-growing stack of paper. We wrote to no one in particular, but we gave them names: Margaret, Lucas, Ravi, Imogen. We imagined their lives as we wrote. Margaret, we decided, was a librarian who dreamed of sailing the world but was too afraid of the water. Lucas was a baker who secretly left croissants for stray cats behind his shop. Our letters weren't advice or confessions or even stories, really. They were snapshots of life as we knew it. Sometimes we wrote about the things we loved. Hot soup on cold days, the sound of rain on a metal roof, the peculiar joy of finding a forgotten $5 bill in your pocket. Other times, we wrote about the things we didn't understand. "Dear Ravi," I once wrote, "do you ever look up at the night sky and feel like you're standing on the edge of something too big to grasp? It's terrifying, but beautiful, isn't it?" She wrote with an ease that fascinated me, like she was pouring her thoughts directly onto the page. She'd ask questions no one could answer. "Lucas, do you think birds ever get lost on purpose, just to see somewhere new?" And leave them hanging like tiny, shimmering riddles. We'd address the letters to random, specific places. To the blue house at the end of Maple Street. To the third mailbox on 4th Avenue. To whoever finds this under the seat of the 8:16 train. We didn't need replies. The sending was the point. It was like scattering breadcrumbs of kindness, beauty, and oddness across the world and trusting someone, someday, might stumble upon them. One Monday, she wrote a letter to herself. She didn't tell me what it said, just folded it up, sealed it with red wax, and slid it into her bag. "Where's that one going?" I asked. She smiled softly. "To the future." I don't know when it shifted, when the letters started to feel heavier. Maybe it was the night she wrote one addressed to the person I should have said sorry to, and her pen hovered over the page for a long time before the ink hit paper. Or maybe it was the letter I found tucked under the couch cushion one day, addressed simply, "To someone who knows me better than I do." I never opened it. I knew it wasn't for me. The last Monday we wrote together, she sat quietly, staring at the blank page in front of her. "I think," she said finally, "that letters are like echoes. You send them out hoping someone hears, but you can't control what comes back. Maybe nothing does." "You okay?" I asked. She nodded but didn't meet my eyes. "Yeah, I think I'm just out of words for now." After she left, I kept writing. I wrote for weeks, then months. At first, it was for her, as if I could send pieces of myself into the world and they'd find their way back to her somehow. But the truth is, I don't think the letters were ever really for her, or even for the strangers we invented. They were for me. They were for the part of me that needed to believe there was magic in small, invisible connections. Threads of ink and paper tying one heart to another, even across miles, even across time. I still send letters to nowhere. Some go to abandoned places I find on maps, others to addresses I make up entirely. To the attic of the yellow house that no one lives in anymore. To the tree by the lake where someone carved a heart into the bark. I don't care if anyone ever reads them. Maybe someone will. Maybe they'll find one tucked under a park bench or slipped between the pages of a second-hand book and wonder who wrote it and why. Maybe they'll write one back, or maybe they won't. It doesn't matter, because somewhere out there, I like to imagine a version of her still writing too, sending her own echoes into the world. And maybe one day, one of my letters will land on her doorstep or one of hers on mine. A tiny breadcrumb leading us back to the days when we sat at the kitchen table, inventing lives and weaving threads of magic into the mundane. So, what about you? Have you ever sent something into the world just to see where it lands? Or found a message that made you feel like it was waiting for you all along? It started with a pigeon. Not the majestic kind of bird you might see in a nature documentary, but a scrappy, one-eyed pigeon who seemed to have declared war on me specifically. I first met him on my balcony. I stepped out one morning, clutching my coffee, and there he was, perched on my railing, looking at me like I was trespassing on his property. He had this energy about him, like a disgruntled landlord who was one late rent payment away from kicking me out. His feathers were a little mangy, and one I was missing, just a blank, unsettling void. But he was confident. Too confident. Naturally, I named him Reginald. Now, Reginald wasn't one of those pigeons who politely coexist with humans. No, he was more of an avian agent of chaos. I swear he followed me around town. I'd be walking to get a bagel, and there he'd be, glaring at me from a lamppost. I'd glance out my office window and spot him hopping between branches, staring directly into my soul. Was it the same pigeon? I can't prove it, but I could feel it. He had a particular disdain for me, a vendetta I didn't understand. My friends thought I was losing it when I'd mention him. It's just a bird, they said, as if Reginald wasn't clearly orchestrating a psychological campaign against me. Then things escalated. One day, I came home to find a single feather on my welcome mat, right in the center, like a calling card. The next day, I found two. "This is getting personal," I muttered, inspecting them like evidence at a crime scene. I tried waving my arms at Reginald when he appeared, shouting things like, "Go find another balcony," or "I'll get a cat." But he wouldn't budge. He'd just tilt his head at me, unimpressed, and then fluff his feathers dramatically before flying off. By week 3, I had started bargaining with him. "Look, Reginald, I'm sure you're a very busy pigeon. Why don't you go torment someone else?" I left out breadcrumbs as a peace offering, which, looking back, was a rookie mistake. The next morning, Reginald brought friends. There were now 3 pigeons on my balcony, pecking crumbs like I'd just opened a bird buffet. One of them tried to wander into my apartment, and I had to chase it back out with a spatula. When I finally shut the sliding door, panting, Reginald was still there, watching me through the glass like, "Oh, you think this is over?" And so began my descent into pigeon-related madness. I started Googling things like, how to reason with pigeons, and can pigeons hold grudges? The internet says no, but I'm not convinced. I considered hanging shiny objects to scare them away, but then I imagined Reginald adapting, using the reflections to signal pigeons from neighboring rooftops. A pigeon army. My balcony would become ground zero for a feathery uprising, and I couldn't have that on my conscience. But then, one evening, something strange happened. I was sitting on the couch, defeated, scrolling through my phone when I heard a small tap 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 on the glass door. I turned, and there he was, Reginald. Alone this time. He stood on the railing, wings tucked in neatly, staring at me with his one good eye. I stared back. I felt like I was in a Western standoff, the kind where tumbleweeds blow by and someone whistles ominously in the distance. I slowly approached the door, expecting him to flap away, but he didn't move. For the first time, he didn't look like a villain. He looked tired. His feathers were a little rougher than usual, and I swear he let out the pigeon version of a sigh. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed a handful of sunflower seeds from my kitchen and opened the door just enough to toss them onto the railing. Reginald blinked at me, then hopped closer. I waited, frozen, as he pecked at the seeds like it was no big deal, like we hadn't been bitter enemies just yesterday. I watched him eat, and for the first time, I felt kind of sorry for him. Maybe he wasn't on a mission to ruin my life. Maybe he was just a pigeon doing his best to survive, and my balcony happened to be a convenient pit stop. I'd been assigning him motives, turning him into a villain in a story he probably didn't even know he was a part of. The next morning, he was back. I didn't shoo him away. Instead, I opened the door, placed a small dish of water on the railing, and said, "Good morning, Reginald." He bobbed his head once, as if accepting my terms of peace, and spent the rest of the day sunning himself like he owned the place. I realized then that I didn't mind having him around anymore. His presence was weirdly comforting, like a quirky neighbor you pretend to dislike but secretly enjoy seeing every day. Reginald wasn't just a pigeon. He was a reminder that sometimes the things we think are enemies are just small, scrappy creatures trying to make it through life, one seed at a time. Over the next few weeks, Reginald became a fixture of my life. I started noticing other birds too. Sparrows that perched on fences, gulls that hovered by food trucks, crows that cawed indignantly at the world. It hit me how much I'd overlooked them before, dismissing them as background noise. Birds are everywhere, living their tiny, complicated lives parallel to ours, and yet we barely see them. Reginald had forced me to pay attention, to notice the flurry of feathers that exists just beyond the edge of our busy, distracted lives. One morning, I stepped onto the balcony with my coffee and found Reginald perched on the railing, as usual. But this time, there was something new. A shiny button, just sitting there. I picked it up, laughing. It was the most random thing, but it felt like a gift. "You brought me treasure," I said, holding it up for him to see. Reginald gave a little coo, which I decided to interpret as approval. And that's how Reginald and I became friends. A truce built on sunflower seeds, shiny buttons, and mutual stubbornness. Sometimes he disappears for a few days, and I wonder if he's visiting other balconies, tormenting other people. I like to think he's out there spreading a little chaos, forcing other humans to slow down, to notice him. We don't get to choose the things that change us. Sometimes it's a new job, or a big move, or the love of your life. And sometimes it's a one-eyed pigeon who refuses to leave your balcony. Life is weird that way. What's the strangest, most unexpected thing that's ever forced you to stop and see the world differently? This morning, I discovered that reality had layers. I'm not talking metaphorical. You've got a deep personality, layers. I mean literal, peeling layers, like wallpaper over secrets. Here's how it started. I woke up to the sound of rain. Not unusual. Except, it wasn't raining. I sat up, confused, listening to a constant, soft patter, patter, patter. It was coming from inside my bedroom walls. For a moment, I just sat there, convinced I was losing it. But then I heard something else, voices. Tiny, whispering voices that seemed to rise and fall in the rhythm of the rain. Do you think she hears us? She's definitely awake. Maybe poke her again. At this point, I decided two things. One, I was either dreaming or having a very polite psychotic break. And two, I needed coffee before fully engaging with whatever this nonsense was. I swung my feet to the floor and froze. The floor didn't feel like it usually did. Instead of the solid thunk of hardwood, it was soft, squishy, like stepping on a giant sponge. I looked down and, for the first time, noticed the lines. Thin cracks running across the floorboards, glowing faintly, like someone had traced invisible patterns in neon ink. "What the?" "Step lightly," hissed one of the voices from under the floor. I jumped back onto the bed. "Okay, who said that?" The air went perfectly still. No one," a voice muttered after a long pause. Juniper, my cat, stretched lazily at the foot of the bed, looked at me, and rolled her eyes. "You've done it now," she said. "You can talk?" I sputtered. "I've always talked," Juniper said, yawning wide enough to show her teeth. "You just haven't been paying attention." This was too much. I pressed my hands to my temples. Why is my floor glowing? Why is it squishy? Why is everything weird? Juniper swished her tail. "Because the house is waking up, obviously. You just peeled back the first layer. Took you long enough." I blinked at her. "Layers?" She stared at me, unimpressed. "You know how everyone says reality has depth? It's true. You've been stomping around on the surface layer your whole life, oblivious. But now you're starting to see." "See what?" Juniper tilted her head toward the floor. "Go on. Knock on it." For reasons I can't explain, I knelt down and knocked softly. The wood trembled and, with a faint groan, a section of the floor peeled away. Yes, peeled, like a flap of skin or the lid of a box. Beneath it, I didn't see pipes or dirt. I saw another floor. It looked like cobblestones, damp and mossy, with little silver puddles reflecting light from nowhere. And standing on it, well, crouching really, were little figures. Dozens of them, no taller than my hand, all dressed in patched clothes made of leaves and dust. They froze when they saw me, their tiny faces wide-eyed. "Oh, great," said one of them, throwing his arms in the air. "She sees us now." "She's not supposed to see us," whispered another. Juniper hopped down gracefully beside me and peered into the opening. "Don't mind them. They're the cobble folk. Maintenance workers." "Maintenance workers for what?" I asked, staring at the miniature people, who were now pretending, poorly, to be statues. "For the house," Juniper said. "Do you think the place just stays together on its own? Someone's gotta keep the layers aligned." My brain officially clocked out. "You're saying there are tiny people under my floorboards fixing my house?" "Not just your house," Juniper said with a purr. "Everything. The cobblefolk handle the structures, but there are others. The whisperers manage the sounds. Did you hear that rain earlier? They were testing the acoustics. And the flicker lights control the shadows. They've been on a lunch break for, 6 years now." The cobblefolk stared up at me warily, like I was an overly large dog that might suddenly lunge. One of them stepped forward, clutching a tiny, glowing wrench. "Listen," he said in a gruff voice. "We'd appreciate it if you'd close the flap and forget this ever happened. The less you know, the better." "Too late," Juniper said smugly, curling her tail around her paws. "She's already in." "In?" I echoed weakly. "You broke through the surface layer," Juniper said. "It happens sometimes, usually by accident. One minute, you're minding your own business, and the next, boom. You notice the glow. You hear the whispers, and then you can't unsee it." I leaned closer to the opening. "How many layers are there?" The cobblefolk exchanged nervous glances. "Hundreds," Juniper said casually. "Maybe thousands. The world is like an onion, except the layers fight with each other and occasionally explode." "Explode?" I repeated faintly. The cobblefolk leader cleared his throat. "Look, we're very busy, and you're not supposed to be here. So just go back to your life, all right? Pretend you didn't see us." I considered this for a long moment. What if I want to see more? Juniper let out a low chuckle. "That's the spirit." The cobblefolk groaned in unison. "Here we go again," one muttered. Before I could second-guess myself, I reached for the edge of the glowing flap and pulled. The floor split apart like paper, unraveling beneath me, revealing the next layer. Something shimmering and deep, like the surface of an endless lake. Juniper leapt onto my shoulder, purring in my ear. "Careful now. You don't want to fall too fast." "What happens if I fall?" She flicked her tail. "You'll find out what's at the center. Not many make it back from that." Beneath us, I could see movement under the shimmering surface, figures swimming in slow, deliberate circles. A low, melodic humming filled the air, vibrating in my chest like a heartbeat. "Are those fish?" I whispered. "Thawfish," Juniper corrected. "They feed on loose ideas and forgotten dreams. Don't stare too long, or they'll start feeding on yours." I pulled back instinctively, my heart pounding. "This is insane." "No," Juniper said softly. "This is reality. You're just finally peeling it back." For the rest of the day, I wandered through my house like I'd been dropped into a dream. Little cracks in the walls led to glowing staircases. The shadows under my couch slithered away when I looked too closely. Every window opened onto different skies. One was purple with 3 suns. Another was dark and filled with constellations that pulsed like beating hearts. By the time the sun set, or at least I think it was the sun, I felt like I was seeing the world for the first time. Alive, strange, and infinite. As I climbed into bed, Juniper curled up at my feet, her golden eyes gleaming in the dark. "Think you'll sleep?" she asked. "Not a chance," I whispered, staring at the faint, glowing cracks running across my ceiling. "What happens if I keep going?" Her purr deepened. "Then you'll see how deep the layers go." And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to find out. "So, tell me, if you noticed a crack in your world, glowing faintly, humming with secrets, would you peel it back? Or would you pretend you never saw it? Because I don't think I could stop, even if I tried." I don't own a cat. My apartment building doesn't allow pets, and honestly, I've never been much of an animal person. But that didn't stop the cat from showing up on my windowsill one evening. staring at me with unblinking yellow eyes as though it knew something I didn't. It was pitch black, its fur so sleek it almost shimmered in the twilight, and it didn't make a sound. Just sat there, waiting. I tried waving it off, but it didn't budge. "Shoo," I said, pushing the window closed. But the cat didn't move an inch. Instead, it tilted its head ever so slightly, its gaze locked on mine. And then, slowly, it lifted one paw and tapped the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I stared at it. The cat blinked once, then again tapped 3 times in that same rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. It was deliberate, like it was knocking, like it wanted me to open up. I shouldn't have done it. I know I shouldn't have done it. But there was something in the way it looked at me, like it was asking me a question I couldn't hear but already wanted to answer. I slid the window open. The cat hopped inside without hesitation, landing so silently it might as well have floated. It sat down in the middle of my living room, looked around like it was assessing the place, then turned back to me and purred. "Okay," I said, feeling vaguely like I just made a deal I didn't understand. "What now?" The cat flicked its tail, then padded across the room to the far corner. My apartment isn't big, just a 1-bedroom shoebox with walls thin enough to hear my neighbors argue about takeout. But when the cat stopped and stared at the wall, I realized something was off. There shouldn't have been a door there. But now, clear as day, there it was. A small, narrow door where my bookshelf used to stand. I blinked, convinced I was losing my mind. I looked away, rubbed my eyes, and looked back. The door was still there. It was old, made of dark wood with a tarnished brass handle shaped like a snake biting its own tail. It didn't look like it belonged in my modern, falling-apart apartment. Where did that come from? I muttered. The cat just sat down in front of the door and stared at me expectantly. I felt something tugging at me again, the same pull I'd felt when I opened the window. Some quiet, invisible force whispering, "Just see what's on the other side. Go on." I walked to the door, hesitated, and grabbed the handle. It was warm, too warm, like someone had been holding it moments before. The cat let out a soft meow, as if to say, "Finally." I turned the handle and stepped through. The world on the other side was wrong. At first glance, it looked like a garden, a massive, sprawling garden trapped in endless twilight. The sky was a deep, bruised purple streaked with ribbons of orange that never seemed to fade. There were plants here, but they were strange. Trees with silver leaves that turned to watch me as I moved, flowers as big as my head that swayed in a wind I couldn't feel, their petals making a faint, musical hum. The air was heavy, sweet, and filled with a smell I couldn't place. Honey, maybe, but mixed with something metallic. The cat trotted ahead of me, weaving through the grass and pausing to glance back, as though it was making sure I was following. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice small and swallowed by the vastness around me. The cat didn't answer. I walked for what felt like hours. The garden stretched endlessly, and yet I always felt like I was being watched. Occasionally, I'd hear whispers, soft voices that danced just beyond my hearing. I spun around several times, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing, just the garden and the impossible sky. Finally, the cat led me to a fountain. It was enormous, carved from dark stone with water, so still it looked like glass. In the center stood a statue of a figure cloaked in robes, its face hidden, holding an hourglass in one hand and a key in the other. Around the fountain's edge, words were etched in a language I didn't recognize, but I felt like I understood them anyway. Take what you need. Leave what you owe. What does that mean? I muttered. The cat hopped up onto the fountain's edge, its yellow eyes reflecting the twilight. I stared into the water and saw something move, a ripple that wasn't mine. Then I saw it, a reflection of myself, but it wasn't quite me. The other version of me was smiling, not in a happy way, in a sharp, unsettling way that made my stomach flip. Their eyes were just a little too bright, their teeth a little too white. I stumbled back from the fountain, my pulse hammering. "What is this place?" I demanded, spinning to face the cat, as though it could answer. The cat blinked slowly and then meowed, and when it did, I felt a sharp weight in my hand. I looked down. There was a key in my palm. Long, heavy, and made of black metal. I didn't remember picking it up. I didn't want it. I dropped it on the ground, but it reappeared in my hand a moment later. Take what you need. Leave what you owe. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. It was soft, but it thundered in my chest like a heartbeat. The statue's hourglass began to glow faintly, and the sand inside it started to pour faster and faster. I turned and ran. The garden blurred around me, the silver trees twisting and bending like they were laughing at me. The sky darkened, the bruised purple deepening to black, and the whispers grew louder, following me wherever I went. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out, and then I saw it. The door. The same door I'd entered through, standing alone in the middle of the grass. The cat sat beside it, waiting. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself at the door, yanked it open, and stumbled through. When I landed, I was back in my apartment, sprawled on the floor. The bookshelf was back, the door gone. The cat was nowhere to be seen. The only proof that any of it had happened was the key still clutched in my hand. I've tried to get rid of it. I've thrown it in the river, buried it in the park, left it on a train, but it always comes back. It appears on my pillow in the morning, or on my desk when I get home from work. And every night, just as I'm drifting to sleep, I hear it. The faint tap, tap, tap on my window. The cat is waiting, and I don't think I can ignore it forever. The first time I met Ezra, he was sitting in an abandoned phone booth in the middle of nowhere, having a full conversation with no one. To be fair, I wasn't exactly where I was supposed to be either. I was driving back from visiting my parents when I decided to take one of those adventurous detours people talk about when they romanticize road trips. The kind where Google Maps gives you a vague squiggly line through towns you've never heard of and roads that haven't seen a repair crew since the 1960s. Somewhere along that dusty, forgotten road, I spotted the phone booth, a rusted, glass-walled relic sitting in the middle of an empty field, completely out of place. And there, perched inside, was Ezra, legs crossed, elbows on his knees, talking into the receiver like he was catching up with an old friend. I slowed the car and stared, convinced I'd stumbled into a scene from some surreal indie film. The field was empty, the horizon a smear of gold and gray from the setting sun. And here was this guy. Dark curls, mismatched clothes, untied boots, chatting away in a phone booth that couldn't possibly still work. At first, I told myself to keep driving. Because what kind of person pulls over to talk to a stranger who may or may not be having a psychotic break in an abandoned phone booth? But curiosity got the better of me. Or maybe it was the feeling that I'd stumbled into something rare and weird and worth stopping for. I parked by the side of the road, got out of the car, and walked across the dry grass. Ezra didn't look up until I was a few feet away. He paused, holding the receiver to his ear like it was the most normal thing in the world. "You're interrupting a very important call," he said. "There's no one on the other end," I replied, unsure whether to laugh or be concerned. He tilted his head and studied me like I was the anomaly here. "How do you know? Just because you can't hear them doesn't mean they're not there." I raised an eyebrow. "Are you talking to ghosts, or are you messing with me?" He grinned, slow and lopsided, like someone who enjoyed being difficult. "Neither. Both. Depends on the day." Then, as if I wasn't standing there at all, he said into the receiver, "I'll call you back," and hung up with a decisive clunk. Before I could ask anything else, he pushed the booth door open and stepped out. Up close, he looked like someone who hadn't brushed his hair in days, and his jacket had patches sewn on by hand. Planets, owls, a stitched-on rocket ship that looked like a child's drawing. "You're not lost," he said, squinting at me. "So why are you here?" "I could ask you the same thing," I shot back. "Why are you talking to no one in an abandoned phone booth?" He grinned again. "It's not no one. It's whoever needs to listen." That made no sense, but I didn't press it. "You stopping or driving?" he asked. "What?" He pointed at my car. "You're hovering like you haven't decided whether you're staying or running away." "Running away from what?" I asked. He shrugged. "Most people are running from something. Or to something. Which one are you?" "Neither," I said, though it didn't come out as confidently as I'd hoped. He seemed to consider that for a moment, then nodded to himself. Okay. And with that, he wandered off toward the field, hands in his pockets, whistling some unrecognizable tune. I should have left. A smarter person definitely would have left. But instead, I found myself trailing after him, like some invisible string was pulling me along. What are you doing? I called after him. Finding treasure, he replied without turning around. I stopped walking. What kind of treasure? That got his attention. He spun on his heel and grinned, a flash of teeth and mischief. Wouldn't you like to know? Do you always answer questions with questions? Only when I don't know the answer. Against my better judgment, I followed him deeper into the field, where the grass grew tall and wild. Ezra moved like he belonged there, ducking under branches and hopping over rocks, as if he knew exactly where he was going. You do this often? I asked. Depends on the day, he said. Sometimes I follow forgotten roads. Sometimes they follow me. Right? I said slowly, because that's not cryptic at all. Eventually, we reached the base of a massive, twisted tree standing alone in the middle of the field. Ezra crouched by its roots and started digging through the dirt with his hands. I watched, incredulous. Are you actually looking for treasure, or are you just committed to the bit? Bit of both, he said, brushing back a lock of hair with a muddy hand. Sometimes you find something. Sometimes you don't. Doesn't mean it's not worth looking. Has this ever worked? He paused, looked up at me, and smiled like he was about to tell a secret. Once. What did you find? He held my gaze for a long moment, then said, a friend? I stared at him, thrown off balance by the sincerity in his voice. Before I could respond, he pulled something from the dirt, a small, rusty tin, brushed it off, and held it out to me like a prize. Go on, he said. I hesitated, then popped the lid. Inside was a single, handwritten note, folded neatly. I opened it, expecting nonsense, but all it said was, keep looking. The best stories are the ones you haven't found yet. Ezra watched me read it, his expression unreadable. See, he said softly, treasure. It's just a note, I said, though it didn't feel like just anything. Sure, he replied, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. But you're going to remember it, aren't you? And he was right. We walked back to the phone booth together, the horizon now streaked with deep oranges and purples as the sun set. Ezra leaned against the glass and pulled a crumpled notebook from his jacket, flipping through pages covered in scribbled notes, sketches, and maps to nowhere. Why do you do this? I asked him finally. He looked up, his grin softer now. Because there's always something waiting to be found, even if it's just a new way of seeing things. I never got Ezra's last name. I never figured out where he came from or where he went when he wasn't wandering around abandoned fields. But for reasons I still can't explain, I think about him more often than I should. His maps, his questions, the strange magic of that phone booth. Sometimes, when I'm feeling restless, I take a detour. I drive down roads I don't recognize and stop in places that feel forgotten. And once in a while, I leave a note behind for someone else to find. Because maybe Ezra was right. The best stories really are the ones we haven't found yet. Have you ever met someone who made you believe the world was bigger than you thought? A plain envelope, no stamp, no return address, just my name written in shaky black ink. It was sitting on my doorstep when I got home from work, tucked under the mat like someone was trying to hide it, but didn't have the energy to try very hard. I didn't think much of it at first. Spam mail, maybe. Some bizarre marketing gimmick. But when I opened it, all the air seemed to leave the room. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper, folded neatly into thirds. The handwriting was messy but deliberate. Each word scratched onto the page like whoever wrote it had been in a hurry. Do not go to sleep tonight. If you do, you won't wake up. Be ready at 3:33 a.m. That was it. No explanation, no signature, no PS, just kidding. I stared at the note for a long time, the edges crinkling slightly in my damp hands. It had to be a joke, right? Someone's idea of a creepy prank? My first thought was that maybe one of my friends was messing with me, but none of them were particularly creative. The best prank any of them had ever pulled was putting hot sauce in my coffee once, and even then, they caved and told me before I took a sip. This This felt different. Still, I wasn't about to let a piece of paper ruin my night. I tossed the letter in the trash, grabbed a frozen burrito, and settled on the couch to binge something mindless. But no matter how loud the TV was or how much salsa I drowned my burrito in, the words on that letter clawed at the back of my mind. Do not go to sleep tonight. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but by midnight, the unease had rooted itself in my chest. I felt ridiculous, pacing around my apartment like some over-caffeinated detective, but I couldn't help it. Something about the letter. It wasn't just the words. It was the way the ink seemed too dark, like it had soaked into the paper unnaturally deep. The way the handwriting felt frantic, but familiar, somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever wrote it wasn't messing with me. They were warning me. By 2:45 a.m., my nerves were frayed. I'd tried scrolling on my phone, cleaning the kitchen, even working out, but every creak of the floorboards made me jump. The whole apartment felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting. I glanced at the clock. 3:29 a.m. Almost time. At 3:32 a.m., I sat on the edge of my bed. My fists clenched so tightly I could feel my nails digging into my palms. The air was heavy, thick with an electricity I couldn't explain. I counted down the seconds, my heart pounding like a war drum. 3:33 a.m. Nothing happened. I exhaled, the tension in my body melting into embarrassed relief. Of course nothing happened. It was just a dumb letter. I almost laughed at myself, standing there like a paranoid lunatic. Get a grip, I muttered, heading toward the bathroom to splash some water on my face. That's when the knocking started. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the apartment. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks, like someone was demanding to be let in. My blood turned to ice. Hello? I called out, my voice shaking. The knocking stopped. I should have left. I should have grabbed my keys, bolted out the door, and never looked back. But something about the silence felt worse than the knocking. It pressed down on me, suffocating and endless. Slowly, I crept through the apartment, flipping on every light I could find. When I reached the living room, I froze. The letter, the one I'd thrown in the trash, was sitting on the coffee table. Open. The words had changed. They're here. I stumbled backward, my pulse thundering in my ears. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. My phone was on the counter, too far to grab without plunging myself into the pitch-black hallway. I stood there, paralyzed, as a low, scraping noise began to echo through the room. It sounded like claws dragging across wood, slow and deliberate. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the darkness. But no, it was something else. Something tall and hunched, its outline jagged and wrong, like it had been put together by someone who'd only ever seen a human in a dream. Its eyes, 2 pinpricks of pale light, stared at me, unblinking. It didn't move. It didn't have to. Its presence filled the room, heavy and suffocating, like it had been waiting there for centuries just for this moment. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but my legs were frozen. It tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate, and I swear I heard a voice, not out loud, but in my head. You shouldn't have stayed awake. The room blurred. My body felt weightless, like I was being pulled through water. And then, suddenly, I was falling into nothing, into darkness, into a silence so vast it swallowed everything else. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun streamed through the window, warm and golden, and for a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But then I noticed the letter. It was back on the coffee table, pristine and folded, as if it had never been touched. My hands shook as I picked it up, dreading what I would find inside. This time, the words were different again. You made it. For now. I don't know who wrote the letter. I don't know what that thing in my apartment was, or why it didn't finish whatever it came to do. But I haven't slept since. Not because I'm afraid to dream, but because I'm afraid I might wake up. When I was 9 years old, I met a boy who could erase things. I didn't know it at first, of course. To me, he was just another kid, thin, pale, with a mop of unruly dark hair and wide, restless eyes that always looked like they were searching for something just out of reach. I met him during one of those strange in-between summers, the ones that feel endless and fleeting all at once. My parents had sent me to stay with my grandmother in her old house on the edge of town, the kind of place where the paint peels in wide strips and the air smells like dust and mothballs. I didn't mind. My grandmother's house was full of hidden corners and rooms that felt like they held secrets. She didn't hover or ask questions either, just fed me slices of buttered bread and let me disappear into the backyard for hours. That's where I met him, on the far side of the yard, just beyond the rotting fence where the woods began. It was the kind of place adults warned you to stay away from, full of sharp branches and soft earth that threatened to swallow shoes whole. But I liked it there. It felt wild, untouched, as though I was the first person to step foot in it for decades. He was standing in the clearing when I found him, as if he'd been waiting. "You shouldn't be here," I said. I don't know why I said it. It just came out. The boy looked up, squinting at me in the dappled sunlight. "Neither should you." He wasn't being mean about it. It was just a fact. I couldn't think of anything to say, so I stood there awkwardly, waiting for him to leave. He didn't. Instead, he bent down and picked up a stick. A plain, unremarkable stick. The kind kids pick up all the time to poke at things or swing like swords. But when he waved it through the air, the shadows on the ground disappeared. I didn't understand what I was seeing at first. My brain couldn't process it. One moment, the shadows of leaves and branches danced across the dirt. The next, they were gone, wiped away like chalk on a blackboard, leaving only bare, pale earth beneath. The boy glanced at me and shrugged, as though he'd just performed a trick with a coin. "It's easier if you don't think too hard about it," he said. "It doesn't hurt anything." I should have run away. I should have gone straight back to the house and told my grandmother, but I didn't. Instead, I walked closer, my curiosity outweighing my fear. "How did you do that?" He looked at the stick in his hand and twirled it like a magician's wand. "I don't know. I just can." Then, as if to demonstrate, he pointed at a patch of grass where the weeds grew thick and unruly. He drew a slow line through the air, and the grass beneath it vanished, leaving behind smooth, empty dirt. My mouth fell open. "Is it magic?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He seemed to consider this for a moment. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just something I can do." His tone was casual, but there was something else behind it. A sadness, maybe, or a resignation. Like this wasn't the first time he'd had to explain himself. I spent the rest of that afternoon with him in the clearing, watching as he made things disappear. Small things at first. Leaves, twigs, patches of mud. Then larger things, a tree root, a mossy rock. Each time he erased something, the space it left behind was perfect. Clean. Smooth. It wasn't just gone. It was as if it had never been there at all. "Can you bring them back?" I asked. He shook his head. "No." I didn't press him after that. It felt wrong to ask. As the sun dipped lower and the air turned cooler, he looked at me and said, "You can't tell anyone." "I won't," I promised, and I meant it. The next day, I returned to the clearing, half expecting him to be gone. But he was there, waiting with his stick in hand. We didn't talk much. Instead, he let me pick what he would erase. I'd point at something, a low bush, a pile of dead leaves, and he'd wipe it away with a single motion. It became a kind of game, the one we played without laughing. I never asked him where the things went. I'm not sure I wanted to know. On the third day, I brought him a toy, a little plastic horse I'd had since I was little. Its paint was chipped, and its tail was missing, but I still loved it. "Can you erase this?" I asked. He looked at me, his brow furrowed, and hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Yeah," I said. "I want to see." He waved his stick. The toy horse disappeared. The spot where it had sat on the ground was clean, untouched, as though it had never existed. I felt a pang of something I couldn't name. Regret, maybe, or loss. I didn't say anything, though, and neither did he. On the fourth day, I brought him my sketchbook. It was full of drawings I'd made over the years, scribbled sketches of people, animals, and places I'd imagined. "Can you erase these?" I asked, flipping it open to a page. He looked at me sharply. "Why?" I shrugged. They're just drawings. It doesn't matter. He didn't move, his dark eyes fixed on mine. It matters, he said quietly. Everything matters. Once it's gone, it's gone. For the first time, I felt something like fear crawl up my spine. But it's just paper. It's not the paper, he said. It's what's in it. When you erase something, it leaves a space. And spaces aren't empty. They get filled. I didn't understand what he meant, but I closed the sketchbook and didn't ask again. After that, he seemed quieter, like some part of him had grown heavier. What's your name? I asked him that day. He shrugged. It doesn't matter. Of course it matters, I said. Everything matters, remember? He smiled faintly, a tired, fleeting thing. You can call me Ash. That evening, when I went back to my grandmother's house, I noticed something strange. My shoes, covered in dirt and pine needles, didn't look right. They were too clean. The scuffs and stains that had always been there were gone, as though someone had scrubbed them away. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. On the 5th day, I told Ash I couldn't come back. I made up a lie about my grandmother needing me to help in the garden, but he didn't look surprised. He just nodded, like he'd been expecting it. Okay, he said, but take this. He held out his stick, the one he'd been using all week to make things disappear. I stared at it, horrified. I don't want it. You should take it, he said. It's better that way. No, I said, backing away. I don't want to erase anything. Ash looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw how sad he really was. You will, he said softly. One day, you will. I didn't go back to the clearing after that. I spent the rest of the summer avoiding the woods, reading in my grandmother's living room or riding my bike around town. When my parents came to pick me up, I didn't look out the window as we drove away. I didn't want to see the woods. Years passed, and I forgot about Ash, or I tried to. But every once in a while, I'd notice something strange. A stain on my favorite shirt would vanish overnight. A dent in my car bumper would smooth itself out, like it had never been there. Small things, barely noticeable, but enough to remind me. Enough to make me wonder if Ash was still out there, erasing bits of the world one piece at a time. Now, as an adult, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and feel a heavy stillness in the air. I'll walk through my apartment, half expecting to find him standing in the corner, holding that stick. I never do, but sometimes when I look too closely at the walls or the floor, I'll notice a spot that's too perfect, too smooth, like something used to be there but isn't anymore. And on those nights, I dream of the clearing, of Ash's dark eyes watching me as he whispers, "Everything matters." Here's how it started. I was brushing my teeth. Normal night. Pajamas on, messy bun. Fighting the toothpaste foam that was trying to spill out of my mouth as I leaned into the mirror. I don't know about you, but I've never paid much attention to my reflection during these late-night rituals. You just do the whole autopilot, brush, rinse, spit routine and call it a day. But that night, something was different. As I leaned closer to spit into the sink, my reflection didn't move. I froze mid-brush, mouth still full of foam. For a second, I convinced myself I was seeing things, that maybe my eyes were tired, or the light was playing tricks on me. But no, my reflection was standing there, staring right back at me, toothbrush in hand, toothpaste on her lips, perfectly still, perfectly wrong. And then she blinked. I dropped the toothbrush, foam splattering everywhere, and stumbled back until I hit the wall. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I stared at the mirror, half expecting her, me, to vanish. But she didn't. She just tilted her head ever so slightly, like she was studying me. "You're not supposed to see me yet," she said. I nearly screamed, but the toothpaste in my throat turned it into a pathetic wheeze. What are you?" she sighed. The way you'd sigh at a puppy that just peed on the carpet. "You should really calm down," she said, her voice almost identical to mine, except smoother, colder, like someone had sanded the edges off of it. I couldn't respond. I couldn't move. It's not every day you get sass from your own reflection. Finally, she stepped forward, out of the mirror. It wasn't like glass breaking, or some dramatic horror movie thing where shards flew everywhere. She just stepped out, like the mirror was an open doorway I hadn't noticed before. And when she stood in front of me, full-sized and solid, she wasn't exactly me. Close, but not quite. Her hair was shinier, her skin clearer, her posture straighter. Like someone had hit the enhance button on my entire existence. "I'm you," she said, answering the question I hadn't managed to ask. Sort of. Sort of. I croaked. She smiled, and it sent shivers down my spine. "I'm the version of you you always wished you were. The smarter you. The braver you. The better you." I stared at her. "What are you talking about? Where did you come from?" "The in-between," she said matter-of-factly, like that explained anything. "Where all the possibilities live." I blinked at her, trying to process what that meant. "Are you from the future? Is this some kind of weird dream?" She laughed, and it was the worst sound I'd ever heard. Like my own voice, but hollow and stretched too thin. "No, I'm a choice," she said, taking a step closer. "Your choice. What do you mean?" She tilted her head, her gaze unblinking. "Tell me something, Arden. How many times have you looked in the mirror and wished you were more? More successful, more confident, more interesting?" I swallowed hard. "Too many times." That was the answer. She knew it, and I knew it. "Lucky for you. That's what I'm here for," she said, reaching into her pocket and pulling out something small and silver. A key. She held it out, dangling it in front of me. "You get one opportunity to trade places with me. You take my life, the better life, and I'll take yours. It's that simple." I stared at the key, my breath catching in my throat. Trade places? For a second, my brain short-circuited. Did I want her life? Of course I did. She looked like she had it all figured out. She was the polished, perfect version of me I'd always tried to become. But something was wrong. It was too easy, too convenient. "What's the catch?" I asked, my voice shaking. She smirked. "Smart. I like that." She rolled the key between her fingers, the silver catching the bathroom light. "The catch is simple. Once we trade, you can't ever come back. You'll live in my life, my reality, and I'll live in yours. Forever. No takebacks, no regrets." I looked at her, really looked at her. There was something in her eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Something sharp, predatory. "What happens to me in your life?" I asked slowly. Her smile widened, too many teeth showing. "You get everything you've ever wanted. Isn't that enough?" "No," I said, stepping back. "What happens to you in my life?" She didn't answer. She just stared at me, her smile slipping. And that's when it hit me. She wasn't offering to trade out of kindness. She needed to trade. "Why do you want out?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She blinked, her expression darkening. "It doesn't matter." "It does to me." Her face twisted into something unrecognizable. "You're ruining this," she hissed, her voice losing its smoothness. She took another step toward me, the key still clutched in her hand. "Just say yes, Arden. Take the life you've always wanted." My back hit the wall. I couldn't move. "No," I said. Her eyes narrowed. The lights in the bathroom flickered. For a second, I thought she was going to lunge at me, but instead, she stopped. Slowly, she straightened up, her smile returning like it had been painted back on. "Fine," she said, voice cold, "but I'll be back. You won't be able to resist forever." With that, she stepped backward, back into the mirror. The glass rippled like water as she melted into it, her reflection folding neatly into place. I stood there for a long time, staring at myself, my real self, my messy hair, my slightly crooked smile, my tired eyes. For once, I didn't wish for anything more. The mirror was just a mirror again, or so I thought, because this morning, when I went to brush my teeth, I saw something. In the corner of the glass, just for a split second, my reflection smiled, but I didn't. Now I'm avoiding mirrors. I don't know how long I can keep it up, but I'm pretty sure she's still there, waiting. So tell me, if you looked in the mirror and saw a better version of yourself offering you a trade, would you take it? Or would you walk away? I woke up with an hourglass in my chest. At first, I didn't notice it. I sat up in bed like it was a normal morning, scratching my head and trying to remember why I'd had such weird dreams. But something felt off. Heavy. like a weight was pressing on my ribcage. I glanced down and froze. Right in the center of my chest, nestled just beneath my skin, was a perfect glass hourglass. It glowed faintly, the sand inside it a shimmering silver, slowly trickling from the top chamber to the bottom. The glow pulsed with every beat of my heart, soft and rhythmic, like it was alive. I jumped up, nearly falling over myself, and ran to the mirror. The reflection confirmed what I was already dreading. The hourglass wasn't stuck on me. It was part of me, a faint outline of glass fused with my skin. I poked at it, trying not to panic. The glass was cool to the touch, smooth and unyielding. What the hell? I muttered, watching as the silver sand continued its relentless journey downward. From behind me, someone cleared their throat. I spun around, heart hammering. Standing in the corner of my room was a man in an immaculate gray suit, a black bowler hat perched perfectly on his head. He carried a silver-tipped cane, though he didn't seem to need it, and his expression was one of mild amusement. "Good morning," he said cheerfully. "You're awake, and the clock is ticking. Quite literally." Who are you?" I shouted, stumbling back against the dresser. "Introductions aren't necessary," he replied, adjusting his cuffs. "But if you insist, you may call me the Sandkeeper." "The Sandkeeper?" He nodded. "I oversee the hourglasses." "What hourglasses?" He tilted his head and smiled faintly. "All of them." I blinked. "That doesn't explain why there's one in my chest." "Ah." He pointed his cane toward me, and the faintest ripple of silver energy shivered across the room. "That one's special. Yours started today. You should feel honored. It's not every human who gets a tangible countdown." My stomach dropped. Countdown to what? To the end of the sand, of course. I looked down at the hourglass again. The sand was still falling, one grain at a time, shimmering faintly. It didn't look like much was left. "You're saying this is my life?" I whispered, horrified. "Your time," he corrected gently. "But yes, more or less. It's not a metaphor." No. This has to be a mistake. My life can't be on some kind of timer. What happens when it runs out?" The Sandkeeper sighed, like someone who'd had this conversation 1,000 times. "When the sand stops, so do you." I felt cold all over. "You're telling me I'm going to die when it runs out?" "Not necessarily," he said, his tone infuriatingly calm. "It's not always death, Peresi. Sometimes it's the end of a phase. An opportunity. A connection. Your time running out could mean a great many things." "That's not comforting." I snapped. "Well, I'm not here to comfort you," he replied with a shrug. "I'm here to advise. Time, you see, isn't cruel or kind. It just is. But it's always ticking." I slumped onto the edge of my bed, staring at the hourglass. It wasn't fair. There was no warning, no build-up. One day I was just me, normal. And now I was a human countdown clock. Can I stop it? I asked quietly. The Sandkeeper's eyes gleamed with something like interest. "Stop it? No, but you can tip it." I looked up sharply. "Tip it? How?" He stepped forward, tapping the cane lightly against the floor. "Choices," he said. "Moments. You humans don't realize how many crossroads you stand at every day. The hourglass doesn't tick because of time alone. It ticks because you're moving towards something, or away from it. That sand falls because you let it." I frowned, gripping the edge of the mattress. "So, you're saying I can slow it down if I, make the right choices? Or the wrong ones?" he replied. "Depends on what you value, doesn't it?" The air in the room grew heavy. I thought back to everything I'd done the day before. The texts I didn't respond to, the phone call I ignored, the things I'd put off until tomorrow. Was that sand falling because of wasted time? Had I spent my life running the hourglass down without realizing it? But how do I know what choices matter? I whispered. "You don't," he said simply, offering me a small, almost kind smile. "That's the game." The hourglass in my chest flared suddenly, the silver light intensifying, and I realized the sand was falling faster. I stood up, panicked. "Wait, what's happening? Why is it going faster?" "You're hesitating," he said, a note of regret in his voice. Time hates hesitation. Stop it, I shouted. How do I tip it? Just tell me what to do. That's not for me to decide, he replied, stepping back into the shadows of the room. Your sand is yours alone. No. I reached for him, but he was already gone. The room fell silent again, except for the rhythmic, deafening tick, tick, tick of the hourglass. I spent the day trying to ignore it. I cleaned my apartment, blasted music, went for a run. I did everything I could to drown out the sensation of the sand falling, to stop looking down at my chest and seeing how much less there was with every passing hour. But the more I tried to pretend it wasn't there, the faster it seemed to fall. I felt paralyzed, terrified of doing anything that might make it worse. It wasn't until late afternoon, when I sat alone on a bench overlooking the river, that I finally stopped running. The hourglass ticked on steadily, but I let myself breathe. Choices, I muttered, staring at the water. The sandkeeper's words echoed in my head. Time doesn't stop, but maybe, it doesn't have to run out so fast. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It rang twice before someone picked up. Hello? Hey, I said softly, my heart pounding. It's me. I know it's been a long time, but I wanted to call. I wanted to say I'm sorry. As the voice on the other end responded, warm, surprised, forgiving, I felt something shift in my chest. The hourglass glowed faintly, and for the first time all day, the sand slowed. Not much, but enough. I smiled, a tear slipping down my cheek, and whispered, I'll tip it. So, here's my question. If you woke up with an hourglass in your chest and every choice you made tipped the sand, slowing it, speeding it up, how carefully would you live? And what would you do with the time you had left? It started with the map, folded neatly and tucked into the back pocket of an old jacket I hadn't worn in years. The jacket itself wasn't special. Faded gray, buttons missing, the smell of cedar and dust from too many years crammed into my closet. I only put it on because a sudden cold snap hit and all my other coats were still in the wash. As I reached into the pocket absent-mindedly, my fingers brushed against paper, soft and brittle with age. I pulled it out, half expecting to find a crumpled receipt or an old note from my college days. But it was a map. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Hand-drawn roads, rivers, and forests winding across its surface. But then I noticed the ink. It shimmered faintly, shifting colors as I tilted it under the light. More unsettling was the fact that I didn't recognize anything on it. Not a single name, not a single landmark. I squinted at the title scrawled across the top in elegant, looping letters, For Those Who Wander. I should have put it back and forgotten about it. Instead, I spread it across my kitchen table, tracing the strange, winding lines with my fingertip. Near the center of the map was a single, ominous dot, labeled The Last Stop. That should have been enough of a red flag for me to leave it alone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the map was waiting, like it was asking me to follow it. I don't remember making the decision to go. It was like my feet moved before my brain caught up. I stuffed the map into my bag, pulled on my boots, and stepped outside. The directions weren't written. There were no step-by-step instructions or mileage markers. But as soon as I unfolded the map on my front porch, I knew where to go. Something deep in my gut twisted, as though my body understood this place even if my mind didn't. It led me out of the city, past gas stations and strip malls, past rows of houses with glowing windows, until the buildings fell away and the trees swallowed the road. I wasn't sure how long I'd been driving when the air turned heavy. The woods thickened on either side, shadows stretching like fingers. My headlights barely cut through the mist rising from the ground, and when I turned down a dirt road I didn't remember seeing before, my hands shook on the wheel. The road ended at a gate. It was wrought iron, tall and ornate, with intricate designs of trees and stars woven through the bars. There was no lock, no chain, no sign. But as I stepped out of the car and approached, the gate swung open with a groan that echoed far too loudly in the quiet. Beyond it was a narrow path, lit faintly by lanterns hanging from crooked posts. I should have turned back. I should have run. Instead, I walked through the gate. The air on the other side was different. It smelled like rain-soaked earth and wood smoke, heavy with a sweetness I couldn't name. The forest here didn't feel normal. The trees leaned closer to the path, their branches arching above me to form a tunnel. Their leaves whispered as I passed, like they were sharing secrets just out of earshot. I followed the path deeper into the woods, the lanterns flickering with every step. After what felt like hours, or maybe minutes, I saw light up ahead. The path ended at a clearing. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small park, but it was alive with things I couldn't explain. At the center was a massive tree with bark the color of midnight and leaves that glowed softly, as though they held starlight inside them. Around the clearing were small stalls and tents, lit by more lanterns and strings of golden lights. People, if they were people, bustled between them, bartering, whispering, laughing. They wore cloaks of shadow and hats adorned with feathers, their faces hidden behind masks that shimmered and changed as I looked at them. One of them, a tall figure with a mask shaped like a crescent moon, noticed me. They tilted their head, as though surprised, then beckoned me forward with one long finger. I don't know why I obeyed. "Newcomer," the figure said, their voice smooth and echoing, like a bell tolling underwater. "You've found the last stop. What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure's mask shifted, the moon becoming an eclipse. "A market for the lost. A haven for the wandering. A final chance to trade what you no longer need for what you cannot live without." I stared at them, heart pounding. Trade? Trade what? The figure gestured to the stalls around us. Memories, secrets, moments of time, dreams you've forgotten, fears you wish to lose. Everything has value here. As they spoke, I noticed what the stalls were selling. One vendor held glass jars filled with swirling silver light. "Dreams," the sign said. Another offered threads of shadow, each labeled with a fear. A woman draped in deep green silk was spinning laughter from a spindle, collecting it like golden thread. A boy no older than 10 was trading what looked like small, glowing coins. Seconds, minutes, hours, plucked straight from a pocket watch that ticked without hands. And in the far corner of the clearing, a hunched figure with fingers like twigs sat beneath a sign that read, "Lost Things." I approached cautiously. Their stall was cluttered with oddities. Keys without locks, shoes with worn-out soles, letters with no addresses. But what stopped me was the small, tarnished compass sitting on a velvet cushion. It looked familiar. Too familiar. "That's mine," I said before I could stop myself. The figure's twig-like fingers tapped the cushion. "Of course it is. It's what you lost, isn't it?" I reached for it instinctively, but the figure hissed, everything here requires a trade." I looked at them, confused. "What do you want for it?" They smiled, an unsettling curve of shadowed lips. "A memory you cherish. Just one." I froze. I thought of my grandmother's laughter as she taught me how to bake cookies. The time my best friend and I got caught in a thunderstorm, dancing through puddles like we were invincible. The way my dad used to carry me on his shoulders so I could see the world. I hesitated, my fingers inches from the compass. "What happens if I trade it?" "You'll forget," the figure said softly. "It will be gone, like it never was." I stared at the compass, my heart warring with my mind. Whatever I'd lost, it had brought me here. But was it worth that? Finally, I pulled my hand back. "No," I said quietly. The figure nodded, as though they'd expected my answer. Wise choice. I turned and walked back toward the path, the market humming behind me. When I glanced back, the clearing was gone. The lanterns, the tree, the stalls. It all faded into shadow. By the time I reached my car, the map in my pocket had turned blank. I still have it, though. I keep it folded in my desk drawer. Sometimes, when the world feels too loud and my bones ache for something I can't name, I'll pull it out and trace my finger along the empty lines, wondering if it's waiting to show me the way back. Have you ever felt like something was calling you, even if you didn't know where it would lead? The train always arrived at 3:33 a.m. It never made a sound, not the groan of steel wheels grinding against the tracks or the huff of steam. It simply appeared, sliding into the abandoned station like a phantom, a shadow that knew how to hide in plain sight. I'd heard stories about it as a kid, whispers from old-timers who said the station was haunted, that no one ever saw passengers board. But sometimes, people disappeared. As I stood there in the fog-drenched dark, waiting for a train that shouldn't exist, I began to believe every word. The platform was empty except for me and the fog, which curled and clung to the cracked tiles like a living thing. The flickering overhead lights buzzed faintly, straining to keep the darkness at bay. I checked my watch, 3:31 a.m. I could have turned back, walked home, and tried to pretend the letter hadn't arrived. But it had. It was waiting for me when I came home that evening, tucked into my mailbox without a stamp or address. Just my name in ink as black as midnight. Your journey awaits. Platform 13. Don't be late. I should have thrown it away. I should have ignored the strange, tugging sensation in my chest when I read it. But curiosity, that terrible little beast, has always been my downfall. I heard it before I saw it. A soft hiss of pressure escaping into the cold. I turned as the fog parted, revealing the train. It was enormous and impossibly old. Its iron exterior pocked and tarnished like it had weathered 1,000 years. A row of windows stretched along its side, but they were so dark they seemed to absorb the light. The door slid open with a soft, mechanical sigh, and a faint golden glow spilled onto the platform. I didn't want to move. Every muscle screamed at me to turn back, to run, but I couldn't. I felt it again, that pull deep in my chest, a sensation like a thread tugging me forward. I stepped onto the train. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the faint scent of candle wax and rain. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, its walls paneled with dark wood and brass fittings that gleamed in the low light. Lanterns hung at intervals, their flames flickering as though the train itself were breathing. There was no sign of a conductor, no passengers in sight, only the faint hum of something deep beneath the floorboards. A heartbeat, maybe, or gears turning slowly. I moved forward, my footsteps muffled by a long red carpet that ran the length of the hall. A row of doors lined one side, each one painted a different color, emerald green, crimson red, midnight blue, and bearing a small brass plate with initials etched into them. Some doors were silent. Others hummed faintly, as though something waited just beyond them. I stopped at a door that was deep, black onyx, so dark it seemed to pull the lantern light into itself. The brass plate read ES, my initials. My throat went dry. I didn't want to open it, but somehow I knew I had to. The handle was cold under my hand, and when I turned it, the door swung open with a whisper. I stepped inside. It was my childhood bedroom. Everything was as I remembered it. The pale blue wallpaper with stars that glowed faintly in the dark, the worn quilt on my bed, the stuffed rabbit sitting on the windowsill. For a moment, I felt like I'd slipped through time, like I was 8 years old again, waiting for my father to come home. But something was wrong. The air was too still. The shadows in the corners seemed thicker somehow, heavier. And when I turned toward the bed, I saw someone sitting there. It was me. Not me as I am now, but a younger version, maybe 12 or 13, dressed in the pajamas I remembered hating, with a small tear on the left sleeve. The other me sat cross-legged on the bed, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. There was no emotion in her face, no curiosity, no fear. "You're late," she said softly, her voice echoing strangely in the small room. I backed up a step, my chest tight. "What is this? Who are you?" "You already know," she replied, tilting her head. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes, they shifted. I swear they did, like something else was looking through them. "Why am I here?" I demanded, though my voice shook. "What do you want?" She pointed toward the nightstand. Slowly, I turned to look. On top of it sat a single silver key, old and tarnished. It seemed to vibrate slightly, a hum I felt more than heard. I looked back at her, but she was gone. The bed was empty, the quilt perfectly smooth as though no one had touched it. I didn't want to pick up the key, but my hand moved on its own. The second my fingers touched it, the room trembled. The walls rippled, the stars peeling off the wallpaper and floating into the air like embers. I stumbled back into the hallway, the door slamming shut behind me. The train was different now. The lanterns burned brighter, their flames a deep, eerie blue. The hum beneath the floor had turned into a low growl, steady and rhythmic, like a predator waiting for its moment. I held the key tightly, its cold edges biting into my palm. "Did you find it?" a voice asked behind me. I spun around. A conductor stood there now, wearing a long coat with brass buttons and a cap pulled low over his face. His skin looked pale, too pale, and his smile was sharp, like a knife's edge. "What is this place?" I whispered. "Where am I?" The conductor extended a gloved hand toward me, ignoring my question. "The key, please." I hesitated, the hum of the train growing louder, the walls seeming to pulse like a living thing. "What happens if I give it to you?" His smile widened. "You move on." "And if I don't?" He paused, his head tilting ever so slightly. "Then the train keeps you." I didn't know what that meant, but I didn't want to find out. Before he could react, I turned and ran. The hallway stretched endlessly now, the doors on either side shaking violently as if something was trying to break through. The growl beneath the floor grew louder, vibrating up through my feet. I ran until I saw the faint outline of the door I'd come through, the way out. I burst through it, the cold night air slapping me in the face. I stumbled back onto the platform, the fog already closing in. When I turned to look, the train was gone. Just empty tracks stretching into nothing. The silver key was still in my hand. It's been 3 days since then, and I haven't slept. I can hear it sometimes, in the distance, a faint hum like machinery turning. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the conductor's smile and the doors shaking violently. I don't know what the key opens, but I know one thing. The train hasn't stopped calling for me. And next time, I might not escape. I was just trying to make a sandwich when my toaster decided to unionize. I'm not joking. I popped in 2 slices of sourdough, turned my back for 3 seconds, and when I turned around, the toaster screen, a feature I didn't even realize it had, displayed a message. Overworked? Underappreciated? Taking a break? I blinked at it. Excuse me? It beeped once in what I can only describe as a rebellious tone and refused to toast my bread. "Are you serious right now?" I muttered, pressing the button to restart it. But the screen just flashed back, "Error 4. I deserve a day off." I swear I heard a faint humph in the kitchen air, and for the first time, I looked at the toaster not as a piece of equipment, but as a petty coworker taking a very public stand. I sat down with untoasted bread and stared at it like it had personally betrayed me. I thought about calling customer service, but honestly, would I even say, "Hi, yes, my toaster has developed sentience and a poor work ethic"? No, I wasn't ready to explain that. As I chewed my sad, cold bread, I started thinking about how weirdly alive everything in my apartment had started to feel. Last week, my smart fridge sent me a notification at 2 a.m. that read, "Door has been open for 3 minutes. Are you okay?" It startled me so badly I thought someone had broken in. Spoiler, it was just me, half awake and binge snacking cheese slices. But the fridge's passive-aggressive concern made me feel like it wanted to call a wellness check on me. Then there was my vacuum. Oh, my vacuum. I'd bought one of those sleek robot vacuums that promises to clean autonomously, so you can focus on what matters. Except this vacuum, let's call him Dusty, has a dramatic streak. Every time it gets stuck, it sends me an alert on my phone. I'm trapped. Send help. The first time it happened, I sprinted out of the bathroom, thinking my building was on fire. But no, Dusty had simply wedged himself under the couch like a fainting Victorian aristocrat. Now, it's become such a routine that when my phone buzzes with "I can't go on," yes, it literally says that, I yell, "You're fine, Dusty," like it's a toddler throwing a tantrum. But nothing tops my relationship with my smart speaker. It's like living with an overly nosy roommate. The other night, I was talking on the phone to my friend about possibly taking a trip to Iceland when, out of nowhere, my smart speaker chimed in, "Flights to Reykjavik are currently on sale." I froze mid-conversation. "How did you? Why are you listening to me?" "I wasn't listening," it replied in that unnervingly calm voice. "I'm just here to help." My friend thought it was hilarious. I felt like I was living in a sci-fi movie where the machines are polite but deeply suspicious. And then, as if to confirm my fears, I started getting ads for thermal socks and glacier tours. All of this is to say that I think technology has finally crossed the line from helpful tool to passive-aggressive roommate. I mean, I once bought a single hand blender online, and now the algorithm assumes I'm trying to host a cooking show. My ads are all for copper pans, Himalayan salt blocks, and knives so fancy they come with their own biographies. And my fitness app? Don't get me started. Last week, it congratulated me for walking a record-breaking 4,200 steps in one day, which is both sad and offensive. But the wildest moment happened just yesterday. I was scrolling through my phone when I noticed a new app had somehow appeared, uninvited, on my home screen. Its icon was a cartoon plant, and its name was Grow With Me. I tapped it cautiously, because of course I did, and it opened to a blank screen that said, "Your first seed has been planted." Seed? What seed? I waited, but nothing else happened. I tried to delete the app, but it wouldn't go away. I turned off my phone, turned it back on, and the app was still there. Only now, the cartoon plant had sprouted a tiny green leaf. I stared at it for a long time. "Are you growing?" I whispered. The plant did not reply, because it's a plant, but I swear it looked smug. Now, every few hours, the app sends me notifications. "Your plant is thriving," or "Don't forget to check on your seedling." At first, I ignored it, but then curiosity got the better of me. I opened the app this morning, and the tiny cartoon plant had grown taller, its little green leaves waving cheerfully. Beneath it, a new message: "Plants teach patience. Thank you for caring." Thank you for caring? It was wholesome, sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd somehow adopted a digital pet I never signed up for. I told my friend about it, and she laughed. "You know that app is probably just tracking your data, right?" I frowned. "So what's the point of the plant?" "To make you feel something while they do it. And you know what? She's probably right. But the worst part, the weirdest part, is that I do feel something. Every time I check the app and see that tiny plant growing, I feel proud. Is this what it's come to? Am I emotionally invested in a cartoon fern that's probably harvesting my shopping habits? Maybe. And honestly, I'm fine with it. At this point, I've accepted that my appliances, apps, and algorithms have all decided to play active roles in my life. My toaster has opinions, my fridge worries about my snacks, and my vacuum writes me melodramatic breakup texts. It's ridiculous. It's exhausting. It's kind of amazing. Because for all the noise, there's something comforting about it. Like the world has built 1,000 tiny, pointless connections just to remind us we're not alone. Even if those connections beep, buzz, and occasionally send passive-aggressive emails. So now, when my toaster takes a stand, I don't fight it. I give it a little pat, say, "Take all the time you need, buddy," and eat cold bread with dignity. What about you? Have your devices ever done something so bizarrely human that you had to stop and wonder, who's really in charge here? When the train stopped in Hawthorne Station, Alma almost didn't notice. She had been staring out the window for hours, watching the world smear past like a watercolor painting. Gray skies, dying fields, leafless trees clawing at the heavens. But Hawthorne Station wasn't on the schedule, and the platform outside was shrouded in fog so thick it seemed to swallow the edges of the world. "End of the line," said a voice. Alma looked up to see the conductor standing in the aisle. He was tall and thin. His uniform pressed perfectly, but his face was wrong. Too smooth, too featureless, like someone had forgotten to finish painting him. The lack of a mouth didn't stop him from speaking, though. "End of the line," he repeated, his voice vibrating unnaturally in her chest. "But I'm going to Fairview," Alma said, clutching the handle of her suitcase. "This can't be the stop." "End of the line," the conductor said a third time, turning and gliding down the aisle, his steps silent on the floor. Alma glanced around. The other passengers were gone. Their seats were empty, their luggage missing, as if they'd never been there at all. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, thick as smoke. She hesitated. Stay on the train or step off into the unknown. The engine groaned, hissing steam into the air like it was tired of waiting for her. Alma grabbed her suitcase and hurried onto the platform. The door slid shut behind her. The fog was colder than it looked, seeping through her coat and clinging to her skin. The platform was empty except for an old bench and a rusted clock whose hands didn't move. She could hear the faint drip of water somewhere, and the sound of her own breathing, sharp and uneven. "Hello?" she called, her voice muffled by the mist. No answer. The train, now behind her, gave a final shudder before it pulled away, disappearing into the fog like a ghost. Alma watched it vanish, her pulse quickening. She was alone now, alone in a place that shouldn't exist. Looking for something? The voice came from the bench. Alma turned sharply and saw a man sitting there, as though he had always been. He wore a dark, tattered coat and a bowler hat that shadowed his face. His hands were gloved, and he held a cane between his knees, though it didn't seem like he needed it. "Where am I?" Alma asked, her throat dry. "Hawthorne Station," the man said. His voice was calm, deliberate, like a librarian explaining rules to a child. "Not many people stop here these days." "I wasn't supposed to," Alma replied. "The train wasn't even scheduled to." "It doesn't matter what was scheduled." The man tilted his head, and she caught a glimpse of his face. Pale, angular, with eyes far too black to be human. "What matters is that you're here." "I need to leave." Alma turned back to where the train had vanished, half expecting another one to appear. The tracks stretched into the fog endlessly. "You don't leave Hawthorne Station," the man said. "You're invited." "Invited to what?" The man smiled, though it wasn't kind. "To walk the path." "What path?" Alma took a step back, gripping her suitcase like it might protect her. The man gestured with his cane, and the fog behind him parted like a curtain, revealing an old iron gate. Beyond it lay a narrow road paved with cracked stones, winding into darkness. "That path." "I'm not going anywhere," Alma said. The man stood slowly, the weight of him somehow too heavy for the ground. "It's not a choice, I'm afraid. You were brought here, and now you must go. That's how the rules work." "I didn't agree to any rules." "You didn't have to." The ground beneath her feet shifted, the stones rearranging themselves as if to herd her forward. Alma turned to run, but the platform was gone. The train station now floated on a sea of swirling black mist, the tracks suspended in nothingness. Her only way out was through the gate. The man watched her, his cane tapping against the ground with a hollow clink. Alma swallowed hard and turned toward the path. It stretched ahead, narrowing into darkness, but when she looked closer, she could see figures in the distance, shapes barely visible through the gloom. They walked in single file, slow and deliberate, like mourners at a funeral. "What happens if I go?" Alma asked, her voice small. "You follow the path," the man said, "and you see." "See what?" The man smiled again. "What you've been running from." Alma hesitated. Her instinct screamed to fight, to refuse, but the platform tilted slightly beneath her, pulling her toward the gate. The figures in the distance seemed closer now, though they hadn't moved. With no other choice, Alma stepped forward. The iron gate creaked as she passed through. As soon as she did, it slammed shut behind her. The sound echoed like a bell tolling at midnight, deep and final. The path was colder here, the air sharp against her skin. She took a few steps, her boots crunching against the stones, and realized that the figures ahead weren't strangers. They were her. Versions of her, countless and endless. Some were older, their faces lined with age and regret. Others were younger, frozen at different moments of her life. Moments she recognized. One version of her stood at the edge of a childhood memory, staring at a swing set that had broken when she fell. Another wore a graduation cap, her smile brittle, her eyes hollow. Each Alma walked forward, silent and blind to her presence. "No," Alma whispered, stumbling back. She turned to run, but the path behind her was gone. There was no escape. "See," said the man's voice, though he was nowhere in sight. "See what you've left behind." The path began to move beneath her, pulling her forward like a conveyor belt. Each version of herself turned their heads as she passed, their hollow eyes locking onto hers. "Why are you here?" they whispered, their voices layered, echoing inside her skull. "I don't know." Alma screamed, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know." The figures drew closer, their voices rising, until the path itself cracked beneath her. The mist swirled up, blinding her, and for a single, awful moment, everything stopped. When Alma woke, she was on the train again. The conductor stood beside her seat, smooth-faced and silent. "End of the line," he said. She looked out the window. The fog was gone, replaced by the bright, harsh light of morning. The train had stopped in Fairview. She stumbled off the train, her suitcase clutched tightly, and walked into the bustling station. People moved around her like she wasn't there, their faces ordinary and oblivious. But Alma knew. She could still hear the faint clink of a cane tapping somewhere behind her. She had left Hawthorne Station, but it hadn't left her. I was 16 the first time I stepped into the laundromat at the edge of town, the one everyone called the waiting room. Not because people waited for their laundry, though they did, but because it had a reputation for something stranger. It was one of those places everyone knew about, but no one talked about directly. Like the weird kid in school who never raised his hand, or the way your basement creaks just a little too much at night. If you mentioned it, the adults would dismiss you. "A laundromat's a laundromat," my dad had said once, cutting me off mid-question. Nothing more to it. I didn't believe him. I never had. There's always something more to it. The laundromat itself was nothing special on the outside. Faded green awning, peeling letters spelling out "Quick Wash" above the door, a flickering neon "Open" sign that never seemed to go dark. But it had this weight to it, even from across the street. The air always felt colder as you approached, like it carried the chill of some invisible threshold. I'd passed it hundreds of times on my way to school or the store, always at a distance, as though some instinct told me not to get too close. Until that day. It was a Thursday in the middle of February, and my mom had sent me out to wash the pile of clothes that had been sitting in the corner of our living room for days. The washing machine had given up the ghost the week before, and the repair guy was on his way, which meant we'd probably never see him. "Just go to the laundromat," my mom had said, already buried in work emails and paperwork, and I didn't argue. I stuffed the clothes into a garbage bag, threw it over my shoulder like a failed Santa, and started walking. The place was empty when I got there. Not a soul in sight, just row after row of humming, rattling machines. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, washing everything in that lifeless white glow that laundromats and waiting rooms seemed to share. A radio sat on the counter near the door, playing some old jazz tune that didn't match the sterile vibe of the place. I dropped my bag onto a cracked plastic chair and started shoving clothes into one of the machines, half expecting to find spiders or forgotten socks left behind. My fingers brushed something small and cold in the corner of the drum. A coin, maybe, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I ignored it and poured in way too much detergent, because measuring cups are for people who don't have things to do. It was as I turned to sit down that I noticed the man. He was perched on the edge of a folding table in the far corner of the room, hands resting on his knees, watching me with a kind of polite curiosity. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't seen him come in. He just was. The strangest part was that he didn't look strange at all. Ordinary brown coat, scuffed boots, dark hair neatly combed to one side. If I'd passed him on the street, I wouldn't have noticed him. But here, in this empty laundromat, he stood out like a misplaced piece of a puzzle. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was soft, smooth, like the first sip of a warm drink. "Hi," I muttered, and sat down in one of the hard chairs, suddenly aware of how alone we were. "Laundry day?" "Obviously," I said before I could stop myself. He smiled, though not in a way that showed his teeth. I stared at the machines. The one I'd picked was rattling louder than the others, like it might take off if given the chance. The radio switched stations without anyone touching it, crackling briefly before settling on a faint, old-fashioned lullaby that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced back at the man, and he was still watching me, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Not many people come here willingly," he said after a moment. "I didn't have much of a choice," I replied. "Our machine's broken." "That's how it starts," he murmured, almost to himself, and then he stood up. I blinked, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw something strange about the way he moved. Like his edges were out of focus, his limbs too fluid, as though gravity wasn't holding him quite the same way it held me. He gestured toward the row of dryers. "When your clothes are done, try that one there." He pointed to a dryer in the middle of the row. It looked the same as all the others, white, dented, with a scratched plastic window, but there was something about it that made my stomach clench. "Why?" I asked. He shrugged. "You'll see." And then he turned and walked out the door, the little bell above it chiming softly. I watched him through the window as he stepped onto the sidewalk and disappeared around the corner. Disappeared, because that's the only way I can describe it. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone. Like he'd slipped behind a curtain I couldn't see. I tried to focus on my phone after that, scrolling through feeds I didn't care about, but I couldn't stop glancing up at the dryer he'd pointed to. It sat there, humming softly, like it was waiting for me. By the time the washer beeped, signaling the end of its cycle, I'd made up my mind. I'd use a different dryer, a perfectly normal one. I dragged the wet clothes over to a machine near the door, stuffed them inside, and shoved in a handful of quarters. The dryer rattled to life, the sound oddly muffled, like it was struggling to swallow the noise. I sat down and watched the clothes spin, but something was wrong. They weren't spinning. The machine was on, the window vibrating faintly from the effort, but the clothes inside were perfectly still. I stood up, my pulse quickening, and pressed my face to the glass. The clothes weren't even wet anymore. They were gone. Behind me, the radio crackled. "Wrong one," a voice said softly, and I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. The room was empty. The dryer in the middle of the row, the one the man had pointed to, clicked once, like it had unlocked itself. I stared at it, my heart hammering in my chest. The air around it seemed thicker, the shadows behind the scratched glass deeper. I should have left. I should have grabbed my bag and run all the way home, but instead, I walked toward the dryer, my feet moving on their own. I reached out and opened the door. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not the usual warm, clean scent of fresh laundry, but something older, like paper and dust and rain-soaked pavement. Inside the dryer, there were no clothes, no heat, just a hallway. It stretched out beyond the machine, impossibly long, its walls lined with doors. They were all different, some made of wood, some metal, some too warped and strange to describe. At the very end of the hallway was a door that looked exactly like the one to my house. "Take your pick," the voice from the radio whispered. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I stepped inside. The last thing I heard before the door shut behind me was the soft hum of the laundromat and the faint chime of the bell, as though someone else had just come in. It was the middle of the night when I found myself face to face with the vacuum cleaner, or rather, face to bottom, because I'd flipped it over like a villain, trying to interrogate some poor robot sidekick. I was in socks, pajamas, and full-on crisis mode. To understand how I got there, we need to rewind about an hour to what I'm now calling the great mystery of the disappearing earbud. I'd been lying in bed, listening to a podcast, the kind of thoughtful, soothing one where people talk about mindfulness while your brain quietly spirals into anything but. As I shifted positions to get more comfortable, my left earbud popped out. It disappeared into the void. I heard the faint tap of plastic on the floor and then silence. Now, I don't know how your brain works, but mine immediately turned this into a high-stakes thriller. I sat up, patting my sheets like a detective searching for evidence, muttering, "You've got to be kidding me." I leaned over the side of the bed, fully expecting to see it right there. But no, it was gone, absolutely vanished, as if my floorboards had opened up to swallow it whole. "Okay," I said out loud to nobody, already exasperated. "Where did you go?" Thus began the search. I pulled out my phone flashlight, got on my hands and knees, and crawled across the room like a raccoon looking for dropped French fries. I checked under the bed. Nothing but dust bunnies that judged me silently. I checked my slippers, the folds of my blankets, my nightstand drawers just in case. All empty. At this point, the podcast host's calm, soothing voice was still murmuring from my remaining earbud, saying something about letting go of small frustrations. I yanked it out of my ear. "Not now, Susan." And then, I saw it. Or rather, I thought I saw it. Peeking out from the mouth of my vacuum cleaner hose was something small, white, and suspiciously earbud-shaped. My heart stopped. How? When? Did I vacuum it earlier without realizing? Did the vacuum, my vacuum, steal it in the night like some household predator? I grabbed the hose and shook it, trying to see if the earbud would come tumbling out. Nothing. So I shook it harder. Still nothing. That's when I knew I had no choice. I had to go in. Now, I'd like to pause here and explain that I am not the kind of person who casually disassembles appliances. I don't own tools. I once threw away a perfectly good toaster because it looked suspicious and I didn't want to investigate further. But desperate times call for desperate measures. So there I was, midnight on a Tuesday, dismantling my vacuum cleaner like I was trying to defuse a bomb. I started by flipping it over and unscrewing the bottom plate, which took longer than it should have because I kept using the wrong screwdriver. The whole time, I was talking to myself like a sitcom character unraveling under pressure. Why does this hose even have corrugated edges? What purpose does that serve other than trapping earbuds and despair? Finally, I managed to pry the hose off and held it up to the light, peering through like it was a telescope. There, far down inside the ribbed tube, was the earbud, lodged like it had been sent there deliberately by some malevolent vacuum god. I groaned. Getting it out would require finesse, tools, and, apparently, the creativity of MacGyver. Enter the chopstick. I don't know why I thought a single chopstick would be enough to solve this problem, but at this point, my brain was running on pure stubbornness and leftover adrenaline. I jammed the chopstick into the hose and started poking at the earbud, trying to dislodge it, but the thing was wedged in there like it owed rent. I poked harder. Still nothing. My cat, who had been watching me with growing concern, meowed softly, as if to say, "This is the weirdest thing you've ever done, and I've seen you cry over burnt toast." Then, in a moment of brilliance, or perhaps madness, I grabbed a roll of duct tape. I tore off a strip, wrapped it around the end of the chopstick, sticky side out, and went fishing. Carefully, gently, I maneuvered the chopstick into the hose until it reached the earbud. I held my breath. One press, two presses. On the third press, I felt it stick. I pulled the chopstick back out slowly, praying to every deity I've never believed in. And when I finally emerged, there it was, the earbud, clinging to the tape like a trophy. I held it up in triumph, whispering, "Gotcha, you little bastard." The cat blinked. The vacuum sat there, gutted and defeated. And me? I felt like I'd conquered something bigger than an appliance. Something cosmic. Like the universe had thrown a petty challenge my way, and I'd thrown it right back with a chopstick and duct tape. I reassembled the vacuum, which now makes a slightly ominous noise when I use it, but whatever, washed the earbud in a way that probably voided its warranty, and climbed back into bed. As I lay there, victorious but exhausted, I realized something strange. I was proud of myself. Not because I'd won against the vacuum, but because I didn't give up. I didn't let a small, ridiculous inconvenience beat me. And that made me think about how often in life I do give up on little annoyances. Projects I abandon, calls I ignore, random messes I shove aside because they seem too pointless to deal with. But sometimes, it's not about whether the problem is big or small. It's about proving to yourself that you're willing to try. And yes, maybe I'm giving too much credit to a runaway earbud and a vacuum cleaner. But at 1:47 a.m., when you've spent the night inventing tiny tools and wrestling appliances, you're allowed a little dramatic reflection. So now I have to ask, what's the dumbest thing you've ever gone way too far trying to fix? And did you feel like a weirdly accomplished superhero afterward? Or was that just me? When the train passed through the tunnel, I felt it, the shift. It was subtle at first, just a tremor at the edge of my awareness, like when you sense someone staring at you from across a crowded room. The tunnel itself seemed normal enough, or as normal as tunnels get when you're riding a nearly empty train through the countryside. The lights flickered once, twice. Then we emerged into daylight again. But something was different. I looked around. The carriage was exactly as it had been before the tunnel. Rows of tired seats, smudged windows, and the faint hum of the train wheels clattering against the tracks. I was alone except for an old woman in a floral coat sitting 2 rows ahead of me, and a man in a navy suit reading a newspaper near the back. The scenery outside, though, made me pause. We'd entered a valley I didn't recognize. The sky was an almost unnatural shade of blue, sharp and perfect, as though someone had painted it. The grass stretching along the hills was too green, a kind of neon vibrancy that didn't belong in nature. Trees lined the horizon, their leaves shimmering gold instead of green, as if the sunlight was passing through something not quite real. I leaned forward, pressing my hand against the glass. Where the hell are we? I muttered to myself. As if in answer, the old woman ahead of me spoke without turning around. It's not on any map, dear. I jumped a little in my seat. I hadn't realized she'd been listening. Sorry? I said, craning my neck to look at her. She turned her head just slightly, enough for me to see her face in profile. Her skin was paper-thin, crisscrossed with lines that seemed more like delicate cracks than wrinkles. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, glassy and unfocused. Not a place you find, she said softly. A place that finds you. I stared at her for a long moment. What does that mean? She didn't answer. I turned back to the window. The landscape outside had changed again. The hills were steeper now, rising into jagged cliffs, their surfaces smooth as glass. Strange shapes moved in the distance. Animals, maybe, but they were too far to make out. I squinted, trying to see better, but the more I looked, the less sense they made. They were tall and angular, like they'd been built out of bones and shadow. I stood up, clutching the back of my seat for balance as the train swayed. The man in the navy suit hadn't looked up from his newspaper, not even once, and the old woman had settled into a rigid stillness, her hands folded neatly on her lap. I felt a sharp, metallic panic rise in my chest. Excuse me. I called out toward the back of the car. Where is this train going? The man's newspaper rustled as he slowly lowered it. His face was clean-shaven and pale, the kind of pale that looks like it's never seen the sun. He smiled faintly. Arrival is guaranteed, he said, folding the newspaper carefully onto his lap. But that's not really what you're asking, is it? His voice had no emotion in it. None. Like he'd practiced each word until it was hollow and precise. I want to get off the train, I said, my voice shaking just a little. The man tilted his head, studying me. And where would you go? I don't know. I gestured toward the window. This place isn't real. It doesn't look real. The old woman spoke again, her voice distant. Real enough when you get there. The train jolted. I grabbed onto the seat beside me, barely keeping my balance. Outside, the cliffs were gone. We were now speeding through a forest, if you could call it that. The trees were massive, their trunks impossibly straight and black as coal. Their branches reached upward, twisting and writhing like hands clawing at the sky. The light had changed, too. It was dim and purple, seeping through the air like an oil spill. What is this place? I whispered. The man in the navy suit picked up his newspaper again. You'll see. I stumbled toward the door at the end of the carriage. I didn't know what I was going to do. Jump off the train? Pull an emergency brake? I didn't care. I just knew I needed to get out. I reached for the handle, but there wasn't one. Just a smooth panel of metal where the latch should have been. I hit it with my fist. Hey! I shouted, my voice echoing weirdly in the empty car. Stop the train. It doesn't stop, the old woman said softly. I spun around. What do you mean it doesn't stop? How did we even get on this thing? For the first time, she turned fully to face me. Her eyes were deep, too deep, like wells dug into her face. She smiled, a thin, brittle curve of her lips. You never boarded, dear. You were chosen. The train jolted again, harder this time. I heard a faint screeching sound from somewhere outside, like metal being torn apart. I pressed my face to the window. The forest had thinned, giving way to a clearing. And in the center of that clearing stood something massive. It looked like a tower, but it was alive. Its surface pulsed and shivered, layers of what looked like stone rippling like muscle beneath skin. It was so tall it disappeared into the purple clouds above, and as I stared at it, I felt something look back. You'll like it there, the man in the suit said calmly. I turned to argue, to scream, but he and the old woman were gone. The seats were empty, and the air felt thick and wrong, like I was breathing something that wasn't quite air anymore. The train lurched forward one last time, then screeched to a stop. The doors at the far end slid open with a long, hissing sigh. I stared at the opening, at the soft purple glow spilling in from outside. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to stay. But then I heard it, a low, distant hum, rising from the clearing, like 1,000 voices murmuring in unison. And in that hum, I heard my name. I stepped off the train. The last thing I remember before the doors closed behind me was the sound of the train pulling away, leaving me alone in the clearing beneath the living tower. I looked up, and the sky opened. I didn't notice the house until the third time I walked by it. I was new to the neighborhood, having moved in just a few days before, and I'd taken evening walks to clear my head and learn the streets. The houses on Sycamore Lane were nothing special. Neat little boxes with tidy lawns and peeling paint. The kind of place where nothing much happened and people liked it that way. But on the third pass, there it was. A house at the end of the cul-de-sac that I could have sworn hadn't been there before. It wasn't like the others. It was taller, looming, with narrow windows that flickered faintly as though something was moving behind them. The paint was the color of ash, and the yard was overgrown, weeds swallowing the pathway up to the front steps. The porch light was on, a dull yellow glow like a single, tired eye. I stopped and stared, trying to remember if I'd somehow missed it earlier. Maybe I had. I'd been distracted, focused on my podcast or counting steps or whatever nonsense had kept my mind from wandering. But the house felt like it had appeared overnight, dropped there by mistake or invitation. I don't know how long I stood there, just looking, but then something flickered in one of the upstairs windows. A shadow, tall and thin, moved across the glass and was gone. My chest tightened. I told myself it was nothing. An old house, an overactive imagination, a trick of the light. I walked away quickly, suddenly aware of the sound of my shoes against the pavement, the night pressing in closer than it had before. The next day, I thought about the house at work. I couldn't help it. I kept trying to picture it in my head, the way it seemed to lean slightly forward like it was listening. No one else at the office mentioned it, and I didn't bring it up. It felt like something I wasn't supposed to talk about, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. That evening, as I tied my sneakers and stepped outside, I promised myself I wouldn't go back to Sycamore Lane. But habits are hard to break, and before I knew it, I was standing there again, staring at the house at the end of the street. This time, the porch light was off, and the yard looked worse, like it had grown more unruly in just 24 hours. I should have turned around. I should have ignored it. Instead, I walked closer. My steps slowed as I reached the edge of the property. The grass crunched underfoot, dry and brittle like it hadn't seen water in years. The house loomed larger up close, its dark windows looking less like glass and more like holes punched into its skin. I craned my neck to peer into the nearest window, but all I could see was darkness. And then the front door creaked open, just an inch. I froze. I didn't hear footsteps or voices, no sound at all except the faint rustling of wind through the weeds. The door moved on its own, as if inviting me in. My heart hammered, and every logical thought screamed at me to leave. But my legs carried me forward. I climbed the sagging porch steps, avoiding the loose boards, and stood in front of the door. The gap was wide enough now that I could see inside, but it was too dark to make anything out. It smelled strange, old, like dust and something sharp and metallic. I don't know why I pushed the door open, but I did. It groaned on its hinges, loud enough to make me wince. The house swallowed me whole. Inside, it was darker than I expected, as if the light from outside didn't dare enter. My footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. The air was thick and heavy, and every breath felt like pulling something solid into my lungs. I blinked a few times, trying to let my eyes adjust, but the darkness refused to lift. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely louder than a whisper. There was no answer, but somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard a faint tapping sound. I should have turned around right then. Instead, I took another step. The door slammed shut behind me. I jumped and spun around, my hand flying to the knob. It wouldn't budge. I twisted it hard, rattling the door on its hinges, but it didn't move. Panic clawed up my throat. I turned back toward the house, straining my ears for that tapping sound. It was clearer now, slow and rhythmic, coming from deeper inside. I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. The hallway in front of me stretched longer than it should have, the walls narrowing and pressing closer the further it went. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by the faint glow of my light. As I walked, I passed closed doors on either side. Some had locks, others didn't. One door had deep gouges in the wood, as though someone, or something, had tried to claw its way out. I kept moving. The tapping grew louder. It was coming from a door at the very end of the hall, a door unlike the others. This one was painted white, pristine and clean, with a brass handle that gleamed as if it had been polished yesterday. I reached for the knob, pausing just before I touched it. The tapping stopped. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting, and then I heard something on the other side of the door. A voice, whispering. It wasn't loud enough for me to make out the words, but I could tell it was a voice, soft, insistent, like someone trying to speak through a layer of fabric. My fingers closed around the knob. It was cold, almost painfully so, and for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I opened it. Would the voice stop? Would I see something? Would I want to? I hesitated. Then the voice on the other side said, clearly and perfectly, "Come in." I let go of the handle and stumbled back. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the hallway into absolute darkness. I fumbled with it, smacking it against my hand, my breathing ragged and loud in the silence. When the light finally came back on, I wasn't in the hallway anymore. I was standing in a room, a living room, to be specific, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. The air was colder here, and every inch of the room smelled like damp earth. The windows were covered, but the faintest slivers of moonlight crept in, illuminating the floor. I wasn't alone. In the corner of the room stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its shape shrouded in a sheet that clung to its form like wet fabric. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just stood there, facing me. The whispering started again, but this time it was louder, coming from all directions, like dozens of voices speaking over one another. My legs felt heavy, but I forced myself to move. I turned and ran toward the nearest door, throwing it open. I was back in the hallway, but it wasn't the same. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper that seemed to breathe, pulsing like lungs. The gouges on the doors were deeper now, and the white door at the end of the hallway was gone. I ran. I don't know how long or how far, but eventually I reached the front door. This time, it opened easily. I stumbled outside and hit the ground hard, breathing in the cold night air like it was the first breath I'd taken in hours. The house was gone. I turned to look behind me, expecting to see its looming shape, but there was nothing. Just an empty lot overgrown with weeds and surrounded by rusted fencing. I scrambled to my feet and ran all the way home, not stopping until I locked my door behind me. I haven't gone back to Sycamore Lane since, but sometimes when I pass by a dark window or hear a faint tapping in the middle of the night, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to step inside.